If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 26, Territorial Inspection. Harry and the other young wizards who had owls looked nervously at Filch and were considering how to persuade him not to bother the owls when Filch spoke again. "It's a pity," Minerva said. "Owls are friends, and I can't eat them, meow." Harry and the others breathed a small sigh of relief, and thanked Professor McGonagall in their minds. On the other hand, after holding Scabbers for a while and watching him, and finding that he was just tired, Ron put him back in his pocket and then looked at Filch and said helplessly, "It's not just the owls, basically all the animals at Hogwarts are kept by people and aren't allowed to eat them." "I don't really want to eat them," Filch replied, sitting on the edge of the bed and shaking his legs. "I'd rather eat them cooked now, I'm just playing with them." Hearing Filch say that, the others could hardly relax. They could still accept their pets being chased by Filch, even though it was a bit harmful to their pets, but it was better than being eaten. "Go to sleep," yawned Seamus Finnegan, "we have class tomorrow." The sleepy group, not bothering to tidy up their messy dormitories, crawled into their beds and closed their eyes to sleep. The next moment, however, Filch, this restless fellow, transformed into a cat and came out. "Filch, where are you going?" asked Neville, the first to notice his movements. "Meow," Filch replied nonchalantly, and then ran out of the room and disappeared. What did he mean by that? The boys in the dormitory looked at each other. They weren't Professor McGonagall, and they couldn't talk to Filch in cat language. Dean Thomas hesitated and said, "I have cats at home, and from what I remember, they're always very active at night." "Oh, no," Ron spat, "I hope he doesn't get caught, or we'll get points taken off on the first day of school." "I'm more worried about him going to the owl hut." Harry was even more worried about Hedwig. Even though Filch had said he wouldn't eat the owls, Harry would be just as upset if he accidentally hurt Hedwig, but he didn't have the guts to break the school rules and go on a spree on the first day of school. The young wizards lay anxiously in their beds, but eventually fell asleep from exhaustion. Filch, after leaving the room, was halfway up the spiral staircase when he stopped suddenly. His triangular ears flicked a couple of times and then he lifted his little pink nose to sniff the air. It was Minerva's scent. Filch immediately lowered his body and silently approached the door to the entrance of the boys' dormitory. Through the crack in the door, Filch saw Professor McGonagall sitting quietly in an armchair in the common room, her stern face facing the entrance to the boys' dormitory. It was obvious that Professor McGonagall had been waiting for the boy to get restless in the night and had been waiting for him for a long time. Now Filch was depressed. Would his plan to inspect the new territory be aborted before it began? Although he had been unsuccessful, Filch did not give up, for he knew that Minerva could not stay here to watch over him, for her routine had been assimilated by the humans. With this in mind, Filch did not rush back, but settled behind the door to lick his fur. Sure enough, Professor McGonagall got up after a while and left the common room, but Filch was still in no hurry to leave. He had just put a wild mark on Minerva, and while Professor McGonagall appeared to be leaving, she was actually hiding with an invisibility spell, waiting for Filch to jump into the trap. "Minerva's a great liar, but I'm smarter." Filch was lying behind the door, wagging his tail in triumph. It took Filch a few moments longer to sense that Professor McGonagall had actually left, so he jumped up, opened the door to the boys' dormitory and strutted out. After sharpening his paws on the fluffy armchairs in the common room and digging up all the absorbent cotton on the cushions, Filch wandered around the common room with a cotton ball in his mouth, before being drawn into the fireplace. He quickly released the cotton from his mouth and ran towards the fireplace. After circling around the fireplace, and even putting the cat in the fireplace and pulling the ashes everywhere, Filch couldn't find any flue dust, but instead was filled with dust. Filch got out of the fireplace and quickly shook his fur, shaking the ash out of his fur, and made a series of cute black footprints in the common room. Meow. Turning around and noticing the 2 rows of footprints behind him, Filch was suddenly intrigued. Although felines have a habit of covering their tracks, Filch was no ordinary cat, and instead of covering his tracks, he ran back to the fireplace, dug all 4 paws into the ashes, and strolled into the common room, leaving a pile of footprints. He even used his arachnid abilities, not sparing the walls and ceiling. After wreaking havoc in the common room with his paw prints, Filch made his way to the girls' dormitory, having lost interest in the subject. The girls' dormitories at Hogwarts were haunted, and under normal circumstances boys could not enter them, or the alarm would go off if they did. The exception was the rare and special animagus spell, which was a spell that even a senior Auror could not master and was not tested in exams, so almost no one learned it during their student life. The spells couldn't even detect animagi, so Fish's druid spells went undetected by Fish, so Fish opened the door and slipped in without setting off the magical alert in the girls' dormitory. The girls, like the boys, had fallen asleep from exhaustion and no one noticed Fish's arrival. In fact, even if they had found him, they would have welcomed him with open arms. Finding that the girls' dormitories were no different from the boys', Fish grew bored and left the Gryffindor dormitory after a quick look around. Leaving the dorm, Fish wandered around, occasionally sharpening his claws on places that looked good or not so good to him. It was while wandering that Fish came across one of his own. It was a skinny, dull grey cat that looked a little old, and when she saw him, she greeted him, meow. Meow. The two cats greeted each other and then looked at each other silently, blinking from time to time, wiggling their ears, wagging their tails, and touching their cheeks with their noses. These are the unique ways cats communicate with each other, looking at each other and making subtle movements to determine if they want to hurt each other. After a brief, mysterious exchange, both parties confirm each other's friendliness, then meow twice, exchange names and parted ways. Primarily, it was about Fish's animal affinity, otherwise Mrs. Norris, having been raised under Filch's tutelage, would have wanted to impose her dominance even as a normal cat, rather than the peaceful coexistence with Fish that she had chosen. In good humor with his new friend, Fish continued his territorial inspection with his tail in the air. Cough! Suddenly, a familiar cough was heard behind him. Fish's feet froze for a moment, and the next instant he leaped forward like an arrow. Immediately behind him came the roar of Professor McGonagall, 5 points off for Gryffindor. No. 10 points. Chapter 27, Night Tour. Minerva didn't come after me? After running for a while, Fish noticed that Professor McGonagall wasn't chasing him or trying to catch him, and he looked back curiously to see that no one was chasing him, and cocked his head in confusion. As for the wild mark on Professor McGonagall's body, they had already been removed by the troublesome Fish, otherwise he would not have been discovered by Professor McGonagall. So, is this the end? Indeed, Professor McGonagall wanted to bring the boy back, but for one thing, this place was not like the auditorium or the house, and trying to catch the elusive Fish would have made a lot of noise, which was unacceptable to Professor McGonagall. Secondly, Fish would sneak out every night when he was at home, and Professor McGonagall had tried for 3 vacations to break him of that habit, but at the moment she could not get him to change his habit. More importantly, Professor McGonagall really needs to rest. Unlike the headmistress who has nothing to do all day, she still has to teach a transfiguration class tomorrow. Fish didn't know that, and the fact that Minerva wasn't coming for him meant he could keep hanging around. Of course, to be on the safe side, he decided not to go back for the time being, but to go up the stairs that moved on their own and let them take him somewhere else. After a few more moments of wandering, a small ghost suddenly emerged on a nearby wall and jumped in front of Fish, shouting, "Meow!" Startled, Fish bounced upward, and when he landed, his fur bristled, his back arched, his ears ducked, and he stared at the ghost, opening his mouth and baring his sharp teeth. Ha! Tch, it's another cat, Peeves, who jumped suddenly, startled Fish, only to realize that the cat was not Mrs. Norris, whom he intended to scare, so he tried to crawl into the wall and get out of here with a bored look on his face. Then his eyes caught a grey shadow swooping in from the right, passing unobstructed through the center of his head and landing on his left side. Although this caused Peeves no harm, it also startled him. After it went through Peeves' head, Fish remembered that the self-proclaimed ghost was untouchable, but he couldn't lose his momentum and kept his ears down, baring his sharp teeth at Peeves. Ha! The provoked Peeves didn't just walk away, but floated off into the sky, his whole body puffed up and his face twisted into a grimace. How dare you provoke the great Lord Peeves! You little puss! I'll eat you! If it were a normal cat, he would have run away with his tail between his legs, but in Fish's case, he roared defiantly and his little body swelled to the maximum size it could be, 1/2 meter long. Peeves froze, then pointed at Fish and shouted, "I know you! You're not a cat! You're a new student this year!" Although he hadn't been able to attend the Hogwarts welcome dinner, Peeves had heard of his. Meow! Who said he wasn't a cat? An enraged Fish didn't hesitate to jump up and take another swipe at Peeves, who, unsurprisingly, kept missing. Ha 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 ha! You're finished! Uncaring for Fish, Peeves laughed and flew upward a bit, all the while yelling at the top of his lungs, "Students don't sleep!" At the library door. Meow! At that moment, Fish pulled back and sat down on the floor, his round green eyes looked up at Peeves who was shouting above him. He wondered what he was up to. After shouting a couple of times, Peeves found that the student was not running away in panic as he expected, but staring at him as if he was watching a show. "Why don't you run away?" the irritated Peeves asked fiercely. Meow. Fish didn't understand what Peeves was referring to. He hadn't lost even if he couldn't hit Peeves, so why would he run away? Peeves, who didn't understand cat language, watched Fish who was still keeping calm, but he himself didn't seem calm, pulling his hair and shouting in an exaggerated voice, "Aren't you afraid I'll attract Filch and subtract house points from you? Equals, Omega, smiley face?" Fish calmly scratched his chin with his hind legs, ignoring Peeves' shouts. Who was Filch? Why did he care about a point deduction for a kitten? Arg! Peeves flew into the air angrily, "I can't believe you're not afraid." After sulking for a while, Peeves continued to shout, "Students don't sleep! Students don't sleep!" At the library door. Fish watched Peeves yell for a while, and finally got bored, got up, and turned to leave. Thinking Fish had finally gotten scared, Peeves followed him and yelled even louder. Fish was so disgusted by their noise that he picked up his pace, which further compounded Peeves' misunderstanding and kept shouting and pushing any armor he saw nearby, trying to make more noise. To his surprise, Fish saw his actions and joined in, pushing all the armor he saw along the way to the ground, causing a series of metallic clanking noises down the hallway. Peeves. Are all new kids this arrogant these days? After a while of goofing around, Filch finally heard the commotion and approached with an oil lamp and, at his side, he was followed by a friend Filch had just met, Mrs. Norris. Meow, Fish took the initiative to say hello. Meow, Mrs. Norris responded with some uncertainty at the sight of Fish's suddenly larger form. Fish shook out his fur and slowly returned to his original size. Meow. A startled Mrs. Norris backed up 2 steps, but seeing Fish squatting on the spot and licking his paws, she approached cautiously. Fish McGonagall, Filch, who had been at dinner, naturally recognized Fish. Yes. He's the first year he can turn into a cat. Arrest him and lock him up, Peeves urged with a look of excitement. But Filch didn't run to grab Fish as he usually did with the other students. Aside from the animal affinity effect and knowledge of Fish's particular expertise, it was also because he seemed to be on good terms with Lady Norris. "My little girl, do you know him?" asked Filch as he knelt down and scratched Lady Norris' chin. Meow, Lady Norris rubbed against Filch's palm, as if begging for Fish's life. Although Filch didn't understand cats, he could probably guess what Lady Norris was referring to, and he had no intention of locking Fish up in the first place. So he turned to Fish and said, "I know you're in a special situation, so I'm not going to lock you up, but I have to tell the other teachers what happened tonight." "What do I care if you do?" Fish cocked his head to one side, thinking that big-eyed human was as disconcerting as the noisy ghost. Peeves, on the other hand, had nearly scalped him in surprise. "Filch. Are you mad?" Peeves clutched his head in disbelief and shouted as he flew off, "Someone! Filch has gone mad!" Filch looked at the distant Peeves, ignoring his, and continued with a kind expression the other students had never seen before, "Go back to your dormitory after a while, you have classes tomorrow." With that, he got up, picked up the oil lamp and left with a heavy step. Mrs. Norris nodded to Fish and followed his. Meow, Fish crouched in his seat, cocking his head in confusion. Chapter 28, The Depressed Twins. Filch's admonitions were naturally ignored as he continued to wander around Hogwarts, amused by the moving portraits and secret passages. Occasionally he would jump up and slap the portrait figure, then flee as fast as possible to the sound of his opponent's roar. When he got bored, he would find a corner and lie down there, rest for a while, and then set off again. As he made his way down the stairs, Fish turned around and arrived at the grand dining hall on the first floor. After wandering around the great dining hall for a while without finding the talking hat, Fish decided he was ready to go back. As much as he would have liked to leave his mark and scent all over Hogwarts Castle to mark his place, the new place was too big to cover the entire castle in one night. The complex paths inside Hogwarts were nothing to a cat, not to mention the fact that Fish had already left his markings and scent and claw marks everywhere he walked, so it was easy to find his way back. In fact, even without these marks, Fish remembered all the paths he had traveled. Just as Fish was about to turn back, a voice called out to him, "Master Fish." The voice belonged to Comey, the house elf who had cared for Fish for more than 2 years. After Fish had been accepted at Hogwarts, Professor McGonagall would no longer be living there, so naturally Comey had returned to Hogwarts with him. Meow, happy to see someone familiar, Fish took a small step to Comey's side and nuzzled his arm with his nose. Master Fish, the professors will deduct you house points for being out so late. Comey's eyes widened and he lowered his voice to a whisper, remembering Fish. Meow, Fish didn't care about the point deductions, tossed Comey's rag bag and asked him for food as usual. It was okay if he didn't know Comey, but now that he did, Fish wasn't going to let him off the hook. He wasn't going to leave until he gave him food. Knowing Fish's nature, Comey looked around cautiously and said quietly, Master Fish, please follow me. With that, he led Fish into the entrance hall and down the 2 stairs to the basement. Meow, Fish had wandered around the basement a bit earlier, finding nothing special, but out of trust in Comey, he followed him down. He went down the stairs and headed down the hallway towards a huge picture of a fruit plate. He reached out and scratched the pear on the plate. The pear on the picture moved slightly and turned into a green handle, which Comey pulled and opened the picture as if it were a door. As the door opened, out came the aroma of a myriad of mixed foods. Meow. Without waiting for Comey's introduction, Fish, who smelled the fragrance, turned into a grey shadow and jumped out. After a delicious dinner in the kitchen, Fish bid farewell to the enthusiastic house elves and returned to the end of the 7th floor hallway with a relaxed and happy gait. Meow, Fish bowed his head and purred at the portrait of the fat lady. However, his kitten's purr was too quiet to wake the sleeping fat lady. Meow, Fish raised his voice and stood up, scratching at the fat lady's picture frame with both front paws. Who is it? The fat lady woke up from her sleep and looked around, but saw no one. Meow, it wasn't until Fish called out for the 3rd time that he noticed him. Only then did she realize that there was a small cat with tiger spots underneath her. You're the boy Professor McGonagall adopted? I think it's Fish, isn't it? The portraits were always going back and forth chatting, so it was only natural that the fat lady would know about this particular student. Meow, Fish nodded. You did a night tour on the first day after joining the school, no wonder you were assigned to Gryffindor. The fat lady laughed and scoffed, knowing that since the founding of Hogwarts, Gryffindor had always had the highest number of night owls in the house, so she hadn't been surprised. But it's no use meowing at me, you'll have to tell me the password before I'll let you in. Meow, Fish looked down for a moment, remembering what the tall redhead had said to the portrait when he had brought them here, but he hadn't been paying attention. Unable to remember the password, Fish transformed into his human form, took a deep breath and tried to call someone inside to help him open the door. The password is Dragon Scum, so remember it next time. Dumbledore, who had been following Fish all night, finally appeared and stopped Fish from knocking on the door, telling him the password. Dumbledore had been following Fish mainly because he feared he would sneak into the Olory and wreak havoc on the Hogwarts messengers. After all, the Olory was close to Gryffindor Tower. But since Fish was worried about Professor McGonagall returning, he didn't spend much time on the 7th floor to begin with, and Dumbledore had nothing better to do than follow behind with the invisibility spell activated. Bad old man! Shouted Fish. Dumbledore wasn't offended at being called a mean old man, he even liked it. He winked at Fish. Go back to bed, I won't dock you points. But Dumbledore's gesture was a wink to the blind. Fish didn't give a damn about house points, he didn't even have an accurate idea of what they were. With a puzzled look at Dumbledore, Fish dove into the gaping hole in the wall. Back in the boys' dormitory, where the others were still sleeping, Fish reverted to his cat-like form and leapt straight onto Neville's bed, the one closest to the door, stomping on the sleeping Neville, leaving a trail of tiny paw prints on his comforter, bedding, and face. Sleepy Neville just frowned and mumbled incoherently, but Fish didn't wake him up. After using Neville's bedding to wipe his paws, Fish licked his fur carefully for a while before jumping back into his bunk, plopping down on the soft pillows and closing his eyes as he drifted off to sleep. The next morning, the seniors arrived first at the great dining hall for breakfast, but instead of being at their long tables, the Gryffindor house students were gathered around the funnel where the house scores were displayed, confused. What the hell is going on here? Why was Gryffindor's score 20 points lower when classes had just started? The group turned their attention to George and Fred. The twins denied it under the gaze of the students. This has nothing to do with us, said Fred. We fell asleep as soon as we got back to the dormitory last night, said George. We didn't even wash up, Fred continued. And we didn't put on our pajamas, George continued. And Jordan and the others can attest to that, Fred continued. Only after the twins' confirmation did the crowd let them go with a look of suspicion. Then they thought of the freshman who had dared to grab the sorting hat at the house sorting ceremony. By the way, cats are nocturnal creatures. After it was confirmed that Fish had subtracted the points, the crowd's attitude took a 180-degree turn. If it was Fish, then there's nothing we can do. Anyway, we have no hope of winning the cup with Professor Snape around, so it doesn't matter if we score too much or too little. It doesn't matter, we're good enough to make up for the points Fish took away from us. Actually, as long as George and Fred don't get into any more trouble. That's right, that's right. Seconded. Did you hear that? The group talked for a long time and then turned their attention back to George and Fred. The twins? Chapter 29, Lively Breakfast. At that moment, the culprit behind the huge drop in Gryffindor scores was still sound asleep. Fish, Fish, it's time to get up. Seamus Finnegan, who was the first to get up, woke everyone up one by one. Omega, Fish opened his eyes and looked up at him, staring dazedly at the unfamiliar surroundings and remembering that he had been tricked by Minerva into living in this place called Hogwarts. In his cat form, Fish rose from the pillow, front paws straightened, buttocks raised and mouth wide open before leaping off the bed and, by the time he reached the floor, he had transformed into his human form. At the same time, Harry and the others also woke up one after the other, rubbing their eyes and sitting up in bed. After waking up, Neville looked at the messy cat tracks on his bed, sighed helplessly, and then slapped it hard. The others did not share Neville's distress and jumped out of their beds and went immediately to Fish's side. Fish! You're back! They had been worried for a long time after Fish left last night, and if they hadn't been so tired yesterday, they might not have slept well. They gathered around Fish and asked him about the night before. Even Neville, who was stroking the sheets, pricked up his ears. Meow, although he didn't understand what they were asking, Fish was cooperative enough to briefly recount his night's journey, pointing out the highlights. Things like meeting a feline friend named Madame Norris, meeting a strange and noisy ghost, a secret door on the 3rd floor that took him to the 6th floor in one fell swoop, and the kitchen behind the fruit box in the basement. As for being caught by Minerva and having points deducted, to Fish it doesn't matter at all. After chatting for a while, the young wizards put on their wizard robes and went outside. As soon as they emerged from the boys' dormitory, they saw a group of people gathered in the common room and, upon seeing them, rushed towards them. They had 2 celebrities in their dorm. Just like yesterday, Fish was surrounded by girls and the boys had to keep gathering around Harry Potter. It was the cute and cuddly Fish who was more attractive than the legendary savior. Fish looked around the common room and noticed that all the claw marks and footprints he had left the night before were gone, and he grimaced, as was the case at home, where the claw marks he had made one day and the ornaments he had pushed to the floor would be restored the next day under Comey's spell. At first Fish didn't know what was happening, but now he understood that it was the effect of the 2 spells, Restore and Cleanse, that he had learned. But the reason Fish had learned them was not to make up for the trouble he had caused, but to use the spell to restore his half-eaten food to its original state. Unfortunately, it failed, so the spell was rendered meaningless and abandoned by Fish. Instead of brushing his teeth, the new cleaning spell is very good, and he doesn't have to fill his mouth with bubbles, he can do it with a flick of his wand. Of course, he doesn't use this spell to wash his face or lick his fur, which is Fish's habit and pastime. The first-year students, just like the night before, crowded around Harry and Fish as they made their way to the great dining hall, only it was their first time at Hogwarts, and with all the secret corridors, they couldn't remember how to get to the great dining hall and started arguing with each other within a few steps. In the first week, the new students' first class was half an hour later than the seniors, so they could familiarize themselves with the paths. Fish ignored the bickering young wizards and headed for the great dining hall. Even without the smell and claw marks, he remembered where to find food. The first-year Gryffindor students quickly found the great dining hall, with Fish in the lead, and they all took their seats and began to enjoy their breakfast. Just as Fish was reaching out to grab the food, as he had done the night before, Minerva's cold voice rang in his ears, "Fish! Use the silverware when you eat." Fish turned his head and saw Professor McGonagall, who had arrived in the great dining hall at some point, standing behind Fish with a serious look on her face. That was the bad thing about the human form, the senses weren't as sharp as they could be. "I didn't use the silverware last night either, meow." Fish strained his neck defiantly. "That's because I didn't care about you at dinner yesterday." Professor McGonagall picked up a fork from the table and shoved it into Fish's hand. "Use the cutlery." "I'll use it, why are you yelling so loud?" Meow, Fish deflated, grabbed the fork that Professor McGonagall put in his hand and, with the same reverse grip he was used to, grabbed the fork in his hand and forked a ribeye steak, bringing it to his mouth and biting into it. Professor McGonagall looked at the group of silent students next to her and ordered them, "Keep an eye on Fish, don't let him pick up food with his hands again, and." She turned her attention back to Harry and the others, "Keep an eye on him at night and try not to let him escape to go out another night." Professor McGonagall knew that Harry and the others probably wouldn't be able to stop Fish, but it was good to have an insurance policy. Harry and the others, who had the same understanding, looked at each other, nodded with a wry smile, and reluctantly agreed. Then Professor McGonagall repeated many instructions, demanding that Fish not be allowed to miss classes, and explained it especially to the other first-year students, before hurrying off to teach Transfiguration to the rest of the years. When she left, Fish put down his fork and tried to grab it with his hands. "Fish, here," without waiting for others to dissuade him, Lavender Brown, who had already prepared herself, cut her own sausage into slices and popped it into Fish's mouth. Naturally, Fish took a bite of Lavender's fork and chewed it. This scheming girl! The girls around her stared at her, and when they saw that Fish accepted Lavender's offer without hesitation, they grabbed their knives and forks and quickly cut into their plates, then followed suit and forked out their own food, extending their arms toward Fish. Fish's eyes instantly filled with all kinds of food, and he knocked out, picking out his favorite flavors and poking his head out to eat them one by one. The girls who were chosen were thrilled, while those who weren't were disappointed. "Harry, I don't know why I think Fish is treated more like a savior than you," Ron said with a sour look on his face as he covered his chest. Harry was somewhat grateful for Fish's existence. He had been neglected since he was a kid, and wasn't used to being the center of attention for a while, and Fish's existence at least distracted him from a large portion of his attention. "Actually, I want to feed Fish, too. He feels like a cat and you can't help but want to be near him," Dean Thomas said sincerely. Everyone else, including Ron, nodded their heads. They thought the same thing, that's why they were bitter, but they didn't feel bad for Fish. "Do you think I would get the same treatment if I trained as an animagus?" Ron asked the same question as his brother Fred. Professor McGonagall is also an animagus, even the animal she changed is a cat, like Fish. Harry didn't answer directly, but gave a fact that Hermione had mentioned yesterday. Ron thought of Professor McGonagall's stern face and the army of animals that had overflowed the house at the sorting ceremony the night before. "Okay. Is it a gift that the animagus was born with?" "I think it probably is. Or maybe Fish has some special bloodline." The boys mingled and speculated. "Ugh, why wasn't I born an animagus?" After a brief discussion, the group finally decided that this guess was more likely, and lamented. Chapter 30, A Cat's School Life. Under the feeding of a group of little witches, Fish didn't need to move, finished his breakfast and then, surrounded by them, headed for the Charms classroom. Fish didn't know where the Charms classroom was, but luckily they could ask the portraits on the wall and the ghosts passing by, who were happy to show the way as long as they weren't Peeves. In addition to the Gryffindors, there were also Hufflepuff students studying Charms this morning, and they had all been inclined to follow the Gryffindor students in their search for the Charms classroom because of Harry and Fish's presence. Guided by the portraits and the ghosts, the group eventually found the Charms classroom with no trouble. The man teaching the Charms class was little Professor Flitwick, who knew Fish very well. He was waiting in the classroom early for the students to arrive. After seeing Fish, he greeted him with a smile. Fish took a seat at a random spot, followed by a cacophony of voices, and the seats around him were filled with little witches. "Hello," said the Hufflepuff girl who took the seat to Fish's right, looking a little shy. "I'm Susan Bones. Nice to meet you, Fish." "Hello," Fish replied nonchalantly, as Minerva had taught her, and continued to stare at the chandelier-like chandelier on the ceiling, which was swaying so much that Fish felt the urge to jump up and grab it. Susan's greeting was only the beginning, however, as the Hufflepuff girls next to her began to greet Fish first, forcing him to turn his attention away from the enchantment of the chandelier. "Quiet, children," Professor Flitwick tapped the podium with his wand. Standing on a stack of books, his voice was amplified by magic, and suddenly suppressed the noise of the class. "I can understand your fondness for Fish, but it's time to get to class." At Professor Flitwick's reminder, the young Hufflepuff witches gradually regained their composure and took their seats, but still glanced at Fish from time to time. The spell Flitwick taught in the first lesson was a simple one, namely the Lumos spell, a spell used by wizards with great frequency. Not to mention Fish, Even first-year students of some magical families can use it, although the glow may not be very obvious. Moreover, Hermione Granger can also successfully release some light through self-teaching. Of course, this had nothing to do with Fish, who, upon hearing that the Lumos spell would be taught, plopped down on the table and went to sleep. After a while, he became uncomfortable and turned into a cat and crawled into his desk drawer. His behavior naturally caught Professor Flitwick's attention, but he said nothing and continued to explain the spell to the other students in an orderly fashion, and only when he was finished did he wave his wand. Lumos. A white ball of light burst from the tip of Professor Flitwick's wand and floated wobbling to Fish's desk. Fish, who was sleeping, opened his eyes slightly when he felt the light change from outside. He saw a ball of white light drifting in front of his eyes. His pupils instantly dilated and he quickly adjusted his posture, keeping his body close to the ground, his hind legs stepping hard and his buttocks wiggling. After a few moments, Fish jumped up from his desk and pounced on the white light. With a wave of his wand from the podium, the white light thrown by Professor Flitwick immediately avoided Fish's onslaught and flew into the space between the podium and the desks. Without thinking, Fish went after him and then made a light chase in front of a group of young wizards. It was then that Professor Flitwick said, "The spell Lumos is a very common everyday spell, but when you master it, you can do many things, such as entertain a cat." Professor Flitwick had played with Fish with the Lumos spell during his visit to McGonagall House, and it was easy to do it again now. Of course, he had noticed a strange affinity with Fish, and after discussing it with Dumbledore and the others, they had decided that it was a similar gift to that of Avila. Now, Professor Flitwick was using this gift in Fish to awaken a desire to learn in young wizards. The young Gryffindor and Hedgehog wizards did not disappoint Professor Flitwick, and after seeing how much fun Professor Flitwick had with Fish using the Lumos spell, they were all eager to practice the Lumos spell at Professor Flitwick's level. Seeing how motivated the students were, Professor Flitwick dispelled the Lumos spell, leapt down from the pile of books and scooped Fish into his arms. Fish didn't resist. He and Professor Flitwick had a pretty good relationship, although the hair on Professor Flitwick's head was a bit sparse. "Now, get out your wands and start practicing your Lumos," Professor Flitwick said as he placed Fish on his podium, looking at the students with a smile, "and let's see who throws the light that attracts Fish." As a result, the little wizard's enthusiasm for learning was even greater. In addition to Professor Flitwick, who used Fish as an impetus for teaching, Professor Pomona Sprout of Herbology, or the Fat Ant, as Fish called her, was also very lenient with Fish, letting him sleep during lessons and waking him up only when it was time to practice. The two teachers were not irresponsible, but Fish did not need their attention in either class. Learning the spells was not difficult for Fish, both in terms of waving his wand and controlling the intonation of the spell. Cats already have an advantage over humans in terms of physical control, and for a cat that can emit hundreds of intonations with a single meow, controlling the intonation of a spell is really quite trivial. With the bonus that the World Tree Shard grants to Fish's magical reserves and his affinity for magic, it was only natural that he learned magic so easily. Not to mention herbology classes, for a druid, caring for plants is almost an instinct, and even if Fish couldn't remember the names of those plants, with just a little touch, he would be able to discover the characteristics of the plants. Other than spell and herb classes, the only other class Fish could sleep in was History of Magic, and not only Fish, but many of the other young wizards couldn't stand the monotony of Professor Bin's voice, so they rested their heads behind their textbooks and slept with their mouths watering. Astronomy was set for Wednesday afternoons, and Fish was always full of energy in the evening, and stargazing was fun, and Professor Aurora Sinistra had never been a guest in Professor McGonagall's house. There was no escaping Fish's animal affinity. After all, who can say no to a cute cat? In addition to these classes, this week Fish also had defense against the dark arts, potions, and transfiguration, none of which he managed to sleep in. There was no need to say more about Minerva's class. Fish didn't dare make a fool of himself and dutifully followed his to learn how to turn a match into a needle. To put it mildly, Fish didn't really think it was that difficult, but none of the class did it, except for him and the girl named Hermione Granger, who was very hairy and had a bit of mouse-like teeth. For the first time in his life, Fish had earned a point for Gryffindor, and after class, a group of young witches greeted him with compliments and head rubs, and the rat-toothed one kept asking him questions about transfiguration. "It's just repeating what Minerva taught me, it's not that complicated," Fish told the truth, but the rat-toothed girl looked devastated. It was inexplicable. Despite being taught by Minerva on and off for over 2 years, there were still many things about humans that Fish couldn't understand. He didn't sleep in potions class because he had been told to by the others, who had been kind to him, so he agreed. The grey-haired professor was making snide remarks about the Gryffindors, especially the young wizard with green eyes and a scar on his head, who was the target of the grey-haired professor's attention. Yes, Fish remembered correctly, the young wizard he himself called Scarhead, whose real name was Harry Potter, was very famous, like himself, and was always surrounded by people. Fish had expected to be targeted by the greasehead professor as Scarhead, but it was as if Professor Snape had deliberately ignored him, without saying a word to him. Not only was Fish himself puzzled, but the little Gryffindor and Slytherin wizards on the sidelines were taken aback, and afterwards they all had a better understanding of Fish's inexplicable affinity. In fact, Snape himself was a little confused by the fact that, although Fish had done nothing wrong during the potion-making process, his feline instincts prevented him from sitting still and listening to the class, looking to his right and left and fiddling with the contraptions on the table, something Fish was known to do. Snape tried to scold him a couple of times, but the words came too late and he could only console himself by saying that Fish had the same green eyes as Lily and didn't have the nasty Potter blood. He barely spoke to Professor McGonagall and the others privately, such as Flitwick and Sprout, who already knew Fish's quirks and had given him the benefit of the doubt. The reason he couldn't get to sleep in defense against the dark arts class was simple: the smell of Professor Quirrell was so overpowering that he could barely ignore it in human form, but he couldn't sleep well lying on the table, and his sense of smell was too strong in cat form, even with his nose plugged. Fish had no choice but to watch in boredom as the stinker said things in a stuttering voice that did not interest him at all. In addition to these lessons, Fish was doing his nightly patrol of the territory, and although Scarhead and the fat kid tried to stop him, they were too slow to do so, and Fish was able to slip out of the bedroom without any difficulty. In fact, it took him only 3 nights to make his way through Hogwarts Castle, leaving scents and claw marks to mark the territory, except for some very secret passages that he hadn't found, or hadn't found a way to open, and some locked places. But every time he tried to enter the owl hut in the West Tower, mean old Dumbledore would appear and stop him. Gee, how could he do anything to the owls in the tower when he's holding back from eating the rat kept by the red-headed one? Chapter 31, Nicknames. Fish, look at that! We've got flying lessons starting this week! Exclaimed Ron Weasley, Red 4, first thing in the morning, pointing to a notice posted in the common room. This was followed by a look of disgust. I can't believe I'm in flying lessons with the Slytherins, what a bummer. Fish couldn't feel the same way though. He didn't know what flying lessons were and he didn't hate Slytherin students. But with all the talk of the humans around him, Fish was gradually realizing what flying class was, a class that taught broom flying. Oh, I see, Fish realized, Minerva seems to like that. Fish remembered that he once tore into pieces a book with a broom riding human on the cover, and Minerva came back in a fit of rage, not only scolding him, but also chastising him for thinking he did wrong. But in the end, he got his way. You must be talking about Quidditch. Ron was a little excited. It's the best sport in the world. There isn't a wizard who doesn't like it. Other students from wizarding families joined in the conversation and, by extension, began bragging about their own flying experiences, which made young wizards like Harry, who grew up in the Muggle world, gape for a moment. But Fish wasn't interested in Quidditch or flying brooms. He was in a hurry to get to the great dining hall for breakfast. When they arrived, the great dining hall was noticeably noisier than usual. The other 3 houses had also been informed of the flying classes. The first years were eagerly discussing the topic, and the seniors had a few moments to chime in, before quickly going to their classes. Here, as soon as Fish sat down at the long table, Hermione placed a cut steak in front of him and put a fork in his hand. After the initial excitement, the young witches normalized their feeding frenzy and began to think about how they could help Fish integrate into normal life. After a discussion in private, they now took turns preparing the food for Fish and letting him serve it to her. Fish, are you sure about the flying lessons? Hermione, who had never touched a flying broom before, had been very nervous about flying lessons ever since she heard about them, and kept looking for young Muggle-born wizards like her to talk to in order to find some relief. When she saw Fish, she unconsciously asked herself the same question. I don't know, I've never flown before. Fish answered with a fork in his hand and chewing the meat in his mouth badly. After a week at Hogwarts, he was getting used to interacting with other young wizards. Anyway, I'm not afraid of falling, so I won't hurt myself if I accidentally fall, Fish said. Ugh, that's cool. Animagus, failing to find some relief, Hermione scrunched up her face and wondered if she could learn to be an animagus as well. With all this commotion, Thursday arrived. Today's breakfast was a very finely chopped lamb chop prepared for Fish by Parvati Patil, who was a bit of a brunette and had a small ornament on her forehead. Fish was munching on the mutton chops when a small chatter was heard in his ears. It was Hermione, Rat Teeth, who was reciting the contents of Quidditch Through the Ages, the book Fish had cracked. Memorization alone won't teach you to fly properly, Miss Squirrel Teeth. Malfoy approached with a large bag of candy, and when he heard Hermione's ramblings, he couldn't help but say with a sarcastic tone. Before Hermione could say anything in response, Malfoy placed the candy in his hand in front of Fish's face. "My mother sent more sweets, I brought some for you to try," Malfoy said slowly to Fish. Besides the Gryffindor lions, other students from other houses also came by from time to time to bring Fish some food, and Malfoy, who always got snacks from his house, joined in after a few days of reservation. "Oh, thank you, Big Brain." Bright-eyed, Fish quickly opened the bag, grabbed a handful of candy and popped it into his mouth. Malfoy's proud face fell. "I'd rather you call me Draco, if that's okay with you." "It's fine, Big Brain, no problem, Big Brain," Fish said. In fact, the names were easy enough for Fish to remember if he wanted to, he was just more used to calling them his own, and their nicknames, it seemed, had caused a trend within Hogwarts. George and Fred were now called by the number 2 and 3 instead. Even some of the Hogwarts professors sometimes used the nickname to tease each other, and the one with the most enthusiasm for it was none other than mean old Dumbledore. As Malfoy was still trying to get Fish to stop calling him Big Brain, an owl flew up to the long Gryffindor table and dropped a small package in front of Neville, who was trying to listen to Hermione. Neville opened the package and inside was a crystal ball shrouded in white smoke. "It's a remembrall," Neville explained to the group. "Gran knows I always have a short memory, it tells you if there's something you've forgotten to do. See, you squeeze it hard, like this, if it turns red." But suddenly a hairy paw slapped him from the side and knocked the memory ball out of his hand. "Oh, my remembrall!" "Fish!" cried Neville. As a purebred kitty, Fish couldn't resist a shiny crystal ball, so when he saw Neville open the bag, Fish kept his eyes fixed on the memory ball, watched it for a while, and then took the opportunity to transform into his cat form and pounced on it to knock it out of Neville's hands. After knocking the memory ball down, Fish swatted it back and forth with his 2 front paws as he juggled it around the long Gryffindor table. Once the victim, Neville, realized it was Fish, he was fine with it and let Fish pet the memory ball, while the others watched with loving eyes as the kitten played with it on the table, even moving his own plates for Fish to have more fun. "If you like playing with balls, I can have my father get you a better one," Malfoy, annoyed at being left out, raised his voice to get Fish's attention, but Fish was too engrossed playing with the ball to hear him. "You don't need your father, your big head looks pretty round." Ron didn't hesitate to mock Malfoy as he saw how defeated he was. "I guess it's a Weasley tradition to use your head instead of a ball, after all, with your family it's not easy to buy a ball." Ron's eloquence was weak compared to Malfoy's, and Malfoy's counter-attack instantly drowned him out. Just as Ron was getting angry and stood up to strike, Professor McGonagall sensed the commotion and came over. "What's going on?" Professor McGonagall saw Fish, who had messed up the Gryffindor table. "Fish! You're not eating right again." 5 points off for Gryffindor. However, the usual point deductions from professors had no effect on Fish, and even the rest of the Gryffindor students paid no attention to him, except Hermione, who was determined to make up for Fish's point deduction. As Professor McGonagall scolded Fish, Malfoy grabbed his 2 followers and slipped away. "Meow!" Fish, who had been lifted by the back of Professor McGonagall's neck, cried out softly, causing the little witches nearby to feel their hearts melt. Professor McGonagall was unfazed as she gave the students a stern look and pointed to the crystal ball Fish had just slapped and asked, "Whose is this?" "Yes, it's mine," Neville raised his hand warily and explained in a whisper, "It's a remembrall my grandmother made me, I always lose." Professor McGonagall was no stranger to Neville as a student and was aware of his impressive memory. "Keep it if it's yours," Professor McGonagall instructed with a frown, "then put Fish back in his chair, and change it so I can eat properly." "I want a ball too." Fish climbed into the chair in his human form, tugging on Professor McGonagall's arm and pouting. "Don't we have a couple of balls in the house? You've played with them a couple of times and left them in a corner, and that poor Fluffy, you've been playing with him less than 3 days and you threw him." Professor McGonagall reached out and held Fish's head down, rubbing her fluffy silver hair into a tangled mess. "Ooh!" Many of the little witches were biting their handkerchiefs at the sight. She was so enviable. Even though Fish now let them touch his head from time to time, they couldn't be as careless as Professor McGonagall. Under Fish's influence, there were more and more young witches who wanted to become animagi and transform into cats to be near him. Unaware that he had motivated another group of young wizards, Fish, prompted by Professor McGonagall, cocked his head to the side and began to remember, is there? From memory, there was something like that, but the balls had been tossed aside after he'd been pouncing on them for a while, and now he didn't know where they'd gone. As for that Fluffy. Oh, this sausage tastes so good. Fish blinked, sat back in his chair as if nothing had happened, popped a piece of sausage into his mouth and said in a slurred voice. Chapter 32, Flying Lessons. Amidst the excitement and anxiety of the young wizards, time flew by and it quickly reached the hour of 3:30 in the afternoon as Fish followed the rest of the Gryffindors out of the castle and onto the grassy area between Hogwarts Castle and the Forbidden Forest. The Slytherin students were already waiting there, and 21 flying brooms were lined up neatly on the ground next to them. Gryffindors and Slytherins had always hated each other, except Fish. The new Slytherin students greeted Fish with a smile, and the next moment their faces elongated and they gave the other Gryffindors a cold, contemptuous look. In the past, the young lions would have had to show some attitude in return. But now that they had two special people, Harry and Fish, the new Gryffindors decided not to be bothered by the jealous Slytherins, and with their chins raised proudly, they flanked the two to the other side of the broom. Soon after, Mrs. Hooch, the teacher of the flying lessons, arrived. She first gave the new students a stern look with her eagle yellow eyes, but when she saw Fish, her expression softened considerably. There he is again, Ron muttered in a whisper. As the most insignificant member of a family of many children, he was envious of Fish's ability to get everyone to coddle him. Well, what are you all waiting for? Mrs. Hooch's voice was loud and clear, as if she had used an amplification spell. Everyone get over to a flying broom. Come on, hurry up. Fish, ignorant, followed the example of the others and approached a flying broom, bending down and picking it up without waiting for Mrs. Hooch's command. Taking the broom in his hand and feeling the firmness in his palm, Fish licked his lips unconsciously. The small tongue found its way between his teeth and Fish opened his mouth slightly, hesitating for a moment before resisting the urge to take a bite of the broom. Remembering the cover of Minerva's book, which he had torn off, he put the broom between his legs, just as he remembered it. Why didn't it fly? Fish cocked his head to one side, confused, and frowned. Before Mrs. Hooch could correct him, Fish had slapped the wooden handle of the broom. Come on, fly meow. Number Phi Omega Phi. After being slapped by Fish, the broom was instantly stimulated and shot off like a rocket, carrying Fish on his broom 100 feet in the air. Stop! Mrs. Hooch's face went pale as she screamed from below. But the irritated broom didn't care, and once she reached a height of about 40 meters, she began to flail wildly, as if trying to throw the student who had dared to offend her. Meow, ha 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 ha. However, this level of agitation was nothing to Fish, who sat happily on his broom with his fists in the air and a gleeful laugh came out of his mouth. After a while, as if that wasn't enough for him, he rested his hands on the wooden handle of the broom, swung his legs up in a twist, crouched down and dropped his legs as he was fully upside down, and stood directly on top of the broom. The flying broom was now completely enraged, and swung wildly, zigzagging through the branches and leaves of the trees in an attempt to throw Fish off its back. Fish's balance, in human form and with shoes on, really couldn't take the swinging of the flying broom, and it still hurt when the branches hit him. So, just as he was about to fall, he transformed back into his cat form, crouched over the wooden handle of the broom, his sharp claws emerged from the flesh cushions, gripped the handle firmly, and applied the spider step spell. This way, even if the broom had been turned upside down, it would not have been able to throw Fish, and with his body shrunken, the branches would not have been able to hit him, so the broom could not do anything to Fish. After sitting firmly on the broom again, Fish began to try to control it. It wasn't that he was scared, the main thing was that this kind of flying that was out of his control got a little boring after flying for a while. The flying broom seemed to have resigned itself to its fate and, after realizing there was nothing he could do about it, Fish merely tried to wiggle his body a bit and it obediently redirected itself. Meow, Fish craned his neck excitedly and meowed, then took control of the broom to launch herself into the sky. Fish! Don't be afraid. Find a chance to jump here. Unaware that Fish had subdued her broom, Lady Hooch, after telling the others not to move, quickly jumped on one of the brooms and gave chase. Hearing Lady Hooch's cry, Fish looked around and saw his on another broom, following close behind. Meow, Fish meowed to Lady Hooch, then turned around, pressed his body down and took control of his broom in a sharp dive, instantly putting a good distance between himself and Lady Hooch. Well, even though Fish had heard what Mrs. Hooch had yelled, he was only a kitten, so it made sense that he wouldn't be able to understand complex human language, right? The short-haired teacher looked like she was planning to play with me, just like the little professor. That's right, that must be it. As Fish sailed his flying broom through the towers of Hogwarts Castle, Lady Hooch followed behind him, sweating profusely. Whether it was her affinity for animals or her duty as a teacher, Lady Hooch was worried that something might happen to Fish. Until now, she had thought that the flying broom was out of control and that the occasional meow of the cat in front of her was a cry for help. Aside from Mrs. Hooch, the young wizards who were also participating in the flying lesson were also in the dark, each of them worriedly watching the two flying brooms in the sky and praying for Fish's safety. The commotion had even alerted some teachers and students who were temporarily absent from school to poke their heads out of the windows, including Professor McGonagall. Unlike the others, Professor McGonagall understood that Fish's cries were not cries for help, but the boy's cry of excitement after having had a good time. Fish! Stop now! Although she didn't know what was going on, Professor McGonagall could guess that it was probably Fish who was up to no good, and she stuck half her body out the window and screamed at the top of her lungs at Fish, who was still flying with Miss Hooch. Meow! When Fish heard Professor McGonagall's voice, he knew something was wrong, but instead of stopping, he took control of his broom and flew towards the owl hut. He hadn't thought about it before when he was having too much fun, but after Professor McGonagall's voice calmed him down, Fish immediately thought of the tower the mean old man had prevented him from entering. He didn't really want to try to catch an owl, he just wanted to confront the mean old man. Oh, no, Professor McGonagall panicked when she saw where Fish had flown. Dumbledore, who had been standing by the window of the headmaster's room watching the drama, also turned pale, as he hurried to the owl hut, using apparition. However, when Dumbledore arrived at the owl hut, he found that the situation inside was not exactly what he expected. The flying broom hovered in the center of the shed, with Fish in the shape of a cat crouched over it and several owls standing beside it, the owls to its left and right preening it with their crooked beaks, and Fish licking its feathers in response. V. 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 In fact, it was because of the animal affinity that Fish was able to catch the owls in the first place, and until he showed his intention to attack, the owls would not be on the defensive with him. Oh, well, I seem to have worried too much, Dumbledore muttered as he straightened his glasses on the bridge of his crooked nose at the harmonious scene before him. But then he thought that perhaps this was a deliberate attempt by Fish to get him to let his guard down before eating an owl. Dumbledore, who had fought Fish many times, knew how cunning the little cat could be. Of course, it was a far cry from Dumbledore himself. Fish, are you all right? Lady Hooch, on her flying broom, rushed into the owl hut after Fish, causing the owls inside to swoop down and scatter. Headmaster Dumbledore, Lady Hooch was relieved to see Fish safe and sound on his flying broom before seeing the headmaster standing by the door. Good afternoon, Rolanda. Dumbledore greeted his with a smile. Leave Fish to us, you'd better get back to your other students now. Og. Professor McGonagall burst through the door of the owl hut before Dumbledore could finish speaking, the loud bang on the door sending the owls flying again. Fish. Nodding to Dumbledore and Lady Hooch, a dark-faced Professor McGonagall approached Fish, who was trembling with rage. How dare you? However, in the middle of his sentence, Fish jumped off his broom, pounced on Professor McGonagall, and took human form in mid-air. Professor McGonagall could only stop herself, and reached out his hands to catch Fish. Minerva. Fish, who had leapt at Professor McGonagall, pointed to the flying broom behind his and shouted, I want that, meow. Equals? Professor McGonagall flinched at that look from Fish and then snarled, don't even think about it. Besides. 20 points off for Gryffindor. Chapter 33, Unhappy Kitten. Professor McGonagall took Fish back to her office and started lecturing him. No matter how pitiful Fish was, she didn't seem to want to stop. This time, Professor McGonagall was really scared for Fish. What if he fell? Although she knew Fish would be fine even if he fell from a great height, the height he was flying at with a flying broom was not the same. Not to mention the fact that he was flying so fast. A frightened Professor McGonagall spent the rest of the afternoon lecturing Fish, even forcing him to eat dinner in her office, as she continued to berate him. At first, Fish tried to approach Minerva and rub up against her, but this time his cuddling did not work and Minerva's anger did not diminish, but increased. Now Fish knew that Minerva was really angry, so he lowered his head and let her scold him without saying a word. ... Finally, when Professor McGonagall's lecture was over, he shuffled back to the Gryffindor common room. As soon as he entered the dormitory, a group of young wizards gathered around him immediately. "Fish! You were amazing!" They had already heard from Mrs. Hooch that Fish had subdued the broom in the afternoon and had controlled it for the rest of the day. Later in the lesson, Harry Potter had also demonstrated a great talent for flying, but it was nothing compared to what Fish had done earlier. Yes, even Mrs. Hooch can't keep up with you. You should know she was on the national team." Oliver Wood, the captain of the Gryffindor Quidditch team, was excited. He had been waiting in the common room for Fish to return after hearing about his performance, as he seemed to see Gryffindor's hopes of winning the House Cup. "If you learn the rules of Quidditch this year, you can be on our team for next year, and by next year, no, maybe next year we'll have won the House's Cup." An excited Wood paces back and forth in front of Fish, chatting about his vision. "When did I say he was in?" Fish shot a puzzled look at the talking Wood, walked over to an armchair and sat back down, then rested his chin on the back of the chair with a disgruntled expression. The girls, who were already unhappy with the way the boys were surrounding Fish, burst out at the sight of Fish's pitiful appearance and hurried out of the way of the chattering Wood, and the Weasley twins, who were excited by the sight of him, and resumed Fish's surroundings. "Fish, I've got your favorite bee candy. I have snacks from the Muggle world, which I had my uncle get from Muggles. Do you like this ball of yarn?" The girls pulled out snacks and toys, trying to make Fish happy. Fish took a look at what they had in their hands and was mildly impressed, but his mood immediately dropped as he thought about how angry Minerva had been today. True, he was mischievous and a little stubborn, but he wasn't really vicious, and he was a little uneasy that Maleva's attitude today wasn't the same as when she had been angry in the past. There are times when ordinary cats are in a bad mood and don't want to move, and they are not always tempted by food. This reaction made the witches even more nervous, and even the boys were worried that something had happened to him. "Should we take Fish to Madame Pomfrey? Maybe she accidentally hurt herself on the previous flight. Fish, if you're not well, tell us about it." Some of the little witches even burst into tears. "Minerva is angry, and very angry, meow." Fish continued to lean his head on the back of the chair, pouted and said worriedly. The witches were relieved to hear what that was, and proceeded to bring out snacks and toys, whispering softly to cheer Fish up. "Professor McGonagall is only worried about you getting hurt, that's why she's so angry. Yeah, my mom used to get really mad at me too when I did something dangerous when I was little. Everything will be fine when Professor McGonagall's anger calms down." With the little witches reassuring Fish's mood recovered a little. "So, when Minerva's anger subsides, will you let me play with my broom again?" When his mood was restored, Fish remembered something else. Minerva had just said that she would never touch a flying broom again without his permission. Now Oliver Wood didn't quit, he had just found a Quidditch talent. How could Professor McGonagall come and tease him? Is he still the head of Gryffindor? "I'm going to get Professor McGonagall." Wood slammed his fist on the table, turned and walked out of the dormitory, followed by Fred and George, who were not far behind. Angelina, Spinnet and Katie looked at them and then at Fish, surrounded by girls, and after a moment's hesitation, joined Wood's group. This meant that the entire Gryffindor Quidditch team went to talk to Professor McGonagall. Except for the Seeker. Because the Gryffindor Seeker, Charlie Weasley, graduated last year, they hadn't had time to find a new one. When Wood approached Professor McGonagall with his team and explained his intentions, Professor McGonagall sighed. As a Quidditch enthusiast, it was impossible for Professor McGonagall not to see Fish's talent for flying. She was even sure that, in addition to her talent for flying, Fish had a talent for finding and hitting the ball, which was one of her hobbies. But that was only if he played by obeying the rules of Quidditch. With his current disregard for school rules, how could he be expected to follow them? He feared that when the time came, Fish would leave the game straight off the broom or he would be penalized, so it was impossible to trust him to win the game. So, Professor McGonagall didn't want to let Fish touch a flying broom again until he was well behaved, and went to talk to Mrs. Hooch about it. Once Professor McGonagall had made her concerns clear to Wood and the others, Wood could not force the issue, however reluctantly, as Professor McGonagall had made a valid point and it would be unreasonable for her to go any further. As Wood lowered his head in defeat, Professor McGonagall thought better of it and added, "Besides, Fish probably isn't interested in making the Quidditch team, so it's only fair that a new player be chosen for the team as soon as possible. How can that be? Wood, who was full of Quidditch, retorted, how can anyone resist the allure of Quidditch? However, Professor McGonagall merely looked at him with a helpless expression. Behind Wood, George tugged at his robes and said, there are plenty of students from Muggle families who aren't interested in Quidditch, and don't forget that Fish still considers himself a cat, it's only natural that he doesn't like it. Only after George's reminder did Wood remember how special Fish was and let out a long sigh, extinguishing his last hope. Chapter 34, Cats Can Always Be Forgiven. While Wood and the others were discussing the search for a player in Professor McGonagall's office in the Gryffindor common room, Fish was slowly recovering from his loss under the comforting voices of a group of young witches. Cats have always had an irascible temperament, even if there is no one to comfort him, this little depression will not cause Fish much trouble, he will recover naturally after being depressed for a while. Once the Gryffindor students cheered him up, they gave him a few more treats and stopped harassing him. After all, they all have a lot of homework to do, and after a week together, they were no longer as frantic as they were at the beginning. Hermione, the school bookworm, had already finished her homework, but she gritted her teeth, forced herself to stop coddling Fish and went to the library. Besides her, several Gryffindors with good grades had also gone to the library with her. Hermione, how many points did you get today? Several of the senior Gryffindors were walking beside Hermione, whispering to her. Let's see. Hermione looked at a small book in her book-filled backpack. We got a good haul today, 12 points, how about you guys? 0, grimaced a fourth-year student, we had a potions class this afternoon, and all the points earned in the morning were deducted by that old bat, Snape. Students from other years also revealed the points they scored today. Hermione calculated the total score, with a quill pointed at the book, she said, in this case, Professor McGonagall should be deducted from Fish 20 points, the total calculation down, today's marks still have a surplus, as long as Fish is not caught when he goes out for the night, and is not caught by Professor McGonagall or Professor Snape. Speaking of which, Fish doesn't seem to have had any points taken off in the last few nights, so he may have found a way to avoid the teachers. Since Fish never did his homework and often broke school rules, Hermione and the others formed a study group to prevent anyone from accusing Fish of this in the future, with the goal of earning enough points to make up the points deducted by Fish during the week. Although their fears seemed superfluous in the last few days, Hermione and the others did not disband the group out of caution and because they did not want Gryffindor to come in last place. Besides, they gained a lot of knowledge in this study group. Why can't Professor McGonagall be more biased like old bat Snape? The Gryffindors sighed in unison, admiring the integrity of their head of house, but still a bit envious of the Slytherins. The group of students entered the library laughing and joking, and quickly lowered their voices and gathered to begin their study plans for the day. Most of the Gryffindors were much more relaxed than this group of students, chatting in the common room and referring to each other's work, trying to get their assignments to the desired length in the largest font the professors allowed. The quietest of all, of course, was Fish, who not only didn't do his homework, but liked to cause trouble. The determined students didn't bother to pay attention to him, the strong-willed ones went to their rooms, and the weak-willed ones simply stayed with Fish to waste time. However, after a while, they were still under the pressure of homework and returned to their dormitories one after another. After all, if the teacher would take points off them for not doing their homework, they would not get the same treatment as Fish. So in the end only Harry, Ron and a few other unfortunates who lived in the same dormitory as Fish were left in the common room. Fish, we'll play with you when we've finished our homework, okay? Said Harry helplessly to Fish, who had just come in and picked up his quill, as he looked at the history of magic paper that suddenly had a long cut on it. I can tear it up for you, so you'll have an excuse not to turn it in, meow. Fish, who had given in to temptation, pressed his left hand against Harry's history of magic homework, his nails growing sharper and sharper. No, Harry grabbed Fish's palm, pale with fear. It was an excuse Ron had used last week for his herbology homework, when he had thought he could get the professor to back off by blaming Fish, only to have Professor Sprout give him double the homework. The only thing he was thankful for was that Professor Sprout had the good nature and didn't subtract points from Gryffindor. Hey, Scarhead, you're no fun. Fish withdrew his paws and resumed taunting Neville, you little fat man, get out your crystal ball and let me play with it. Yes, at Fish's request, Neville, of course, didn't refuse, and reached into his coat pocket. Oh no, I've lost my memory ball again, Neville cried, something Harry and the others were used to seeing. "I lose things all the time too, it's no big deal," only Fish patted him on the shoulder and smiled broadly. Unable to get a crystal ball from Neville, Fish immediately switched targets and walked over to Ron, squatting down at the other end of the table and resting his head on the table with his hands on the edge and his eyes fixed on Ron, who was pretending to be trying to do his homework. At first, Ron could pretend not to care, but after being stared at by Fish for so long, he didn't even know what he was going to write next. "No." Ron put down the quill and reached over to cover his coat pocket, where Scabbers was shivering. "I told you Scabbers couldn't stand you. I won't eat him, just let him out again and let me play with him." Last time, Scabbers gave up too fast for Fish to have any fun. He reached out his left hand and made a fake grabbing motion next to his head. "I'll pay attention and not kill him, meow. Scabbers in his pocket trembled even more. "No." Ron thought for a moment, but refused Fish's request. "Scabbers is too old to do too strenuous an exercise." "Meow." Fish blinked in confusion, "But he's so energetic, isn't he?" When Fish had first caught Scabbers, the rat had been a fast runner and stronger than the average rat. It didn't look like a senile old rat. As a druid, Fish could sense the basic state of most creatures, and in his perception, Scabbers was not as weak as usual, but had plenty of life in it. But Fish's words were so vague that Ron couldn't grasp his meaning, and he shook his head. "Scabbers just eats and sleeps, where's the vitality in that? Fish, leave him alone. Number 2 and number 3 are right, number 4, you really are an idiot." Fish, who was rebuffed again, puffed out his cheeks and said angrily, "Obviously, that mouse's breath of life is stronger than the redhead's. How can you people say that about me? I'm his brother." Ron blushed, slammed the table angrily and got up from the stool. It was impossible to be mad at Fish, so Ron vented his anger at his brothers without compunction. "I'm going to write to Mum and tell her about all the nice things George and Fred did at school." The twins had just entered the common room after returning from Professor McGonagall's office, when they heard their good brothers roar. George and Fred. Chapter 35, Home. "Dear Ronnie, it's been a long time since we've had a good talk as brothers," said Fran. That's right, why don't we go somewhere quiet and strengthen the brotherhood?" said George. A smiling George and Fred put their arms around Ron's neck and dragged him aside for a chat, while Fish, who had started it all, patted himself on the back and ran off to tease the others as if nothing had happened. Cried Ron. Harry and Neville watched as Ron was forcibly dragged away by his twin brothers, covering his mouth, giving him a good luck look before burying his head back into each other's books and learning from the others' work. With Fish's help, Harry and the others went back to hurrying through their homework late into the night, saying good night to each other as their eyelids fought sleep, and getting into their respective beds, quickly falling asleep. It wasn't something Fish did to disturb the sleep of others, and as the Gryffindors fell into a deep sleep, it was time for Fish to begin his tour of the grounds. Emerging from his dormitory through a hole in the wall, Fish transformed into the appearance of Mrs. Norris. This was a little secret he had discovered the other day, that if it was Mrs. Norris wandering around the school at night, he wouldn't get scolded if he ran into Minerva and the others. So Fish tried to adopt Mrs. Norris's appearance, and even took the initiative to stroll near Minerva, who did not recognize him at the time. Professor McGonagall sensed that something was wrong with him due to his affinity for animals, but he just wandered in front of her for a moment and then left, so he wasn't caught. Aside from Dumbledore, who often followed him stealthily, the only person who really found out who Fish was Mrs. Norris's doe-eyed spoilsport, but Filch didn't unmask him and even fed him dried fish. However, it was Mrs. Norris who was surprised to see Fish's transformation and took a while to get used to it after sniffing and licking him. As soon as he transformed into Mrs. Norris, Fish headed straight for the Owl's hut in the West Tower, much to the delight of Dumbledore, who was in hiding. "Good boy, if I hadn't been clever enough, you would have fooled me." A stealthy Dumbledore smiled and followed close behind Fish, intending to jump out when he attacked the owl and scare the boy. As a headmaster with a bit of a brain, Dumbledore was not a man who followed the rules too well, not to mention the fact that he had suffered twice at Fish's hands, and was desperate to get back at him. However, Dumbledore had followed Fish to the owl's hut and had found that things were not quite what he had expected. Instead of attacking the owls, Fish had reverted to his tiger-spotted cat form, meowing and communicating with the owls. A mixture of meowing and cooing could be heard in the owl's hut, and it sounded like they were having a conversation. Dumbledore watched in amazement as Fish and the owls talked back and forth, and suddenly felt a little less confident in his assumption that he had been born an animagus. The ability to change fur and size and even breed was fine, after all, wizards could do pretty much the same thing, with that strange affinity, and there were precedents like Vila for that strange affinity. But Dumbledore had never heard of an animagus being able to communicate with any other kind of animal. Even a parcel tongue speaker uses snake language to communicate with snakes, and it's no good if he talks to lizards or octopuses. And Fish now speaks to owls in feline language. Even if he changed it to a cuckoo voice, it wouldn't surprise Dumbledore that much. It was enough to make Dumbledore shake his head and put aside the fact that whatever happened to Fish, he was now a Hogwarts student. On the other hand, Fish had finished talking to the owls, had shrunk down to palm size, and had climbed onto the back of one of them. It was a dark brown spotted eagle owl with large yellow-orange eyes and prominent feathers on its ears and both sides of its head, and it was one of the largest owls in the group. Meow. Come on. Phi Omega Phi? Fish gave a command excitedly, and the eagle owl below him spread its wings, jumped off the shelf and slid down the window silently. URG, this is bad. Dumbledore, who was hiding, rubbed his nose, suddenly realizing that this situation seemed worse than Fish's attack on the owls. He hadn't reacted and had let the owl fly away with Fish, and now it would be hard to find him again. And considering Dumbledore's temper, he didn't usually do much to stop Hogwarts students in their little rebellions. The part about telling Minerva what had happened was the part that might be difficult. Dumbledore rubbed his eyebrows together, considering whether he should inform Professor McGonagall first or wait to see if Fish returned with the owl before dawn. He wasn't worried about Fish getting lost, he just feared that Fish would go so crazy out there that he'd forget to get back to school on time, and then Minerva would go crazy again. Hey! Why again? After thinking about it for a few moments, Dumbledore didn't want to get on Professor McGonagall's bad side, and decided to wait and see. If Fish would come back too late, then he would go ask Or for help, and hide it from Minerva as much as he could, until he couldn't hide it anymore. Dumbledore shook his head, a little annoyed that Fish was the one who had to make a scene every now and then, so he was going to go back to the headmaster's office and eat some of his favorite pile of cockroaches to calm himself down. Fish, who flew out of Hogwarts on the back of an owl, to be precise, didn't know that bad old Dumbledore was having a headache because of his own affairs. If he did, he would have been very happy. But now Fish is very happy too, even though the owl's speed is not as fast as the broom's, and he can't control the direction in real time like the broom, and has to rely on communication with the owl. But, nevertheless, he can fly again. The owl flew Fish around Hogwarts Castle and then, at Fish's request, turned around and flew towards Hogsmeade village. After being away from home for so many days, Fish missed his little nest in the cottage. The distance between Hogwarts and Hogsmeade wasn't too great, so the owl flew for a while and carried him to Professor McGonagall's hut, where he picked up his wings and landed on the windowsill, setting him down. Meow. Fish raised his paws and tapped on the window, yelling Comey's name in feline, only to remember that Comey had come back to Hogwarts with him, and that no one was home now. But that wasn't a problem for him, as Fish transformed back into his human form, pulled his wand out of his pocket and pointed it at the window. Meow. Alohomora. Phi Omega Phi, star. But the window did not move. Fish looked at the wand in his hand and then at the window, which didn't respond at all, and the cat scratched its little head in confusion. Meow. In the 17th century, the black sorcerer Eldon Esrical fled from Africa to England with a leopard cub, carrying with him a then unknown spell taught to him by an elderly African wizard, Alohomora, a perfect spell for thieves. Now a thief, Esrical used the lockpicking spell to launch his career as a king of thieves in London, where he was visited by muggles and wizards alike, and where he was occasionally captured in exchange for his freedom, leading to the emergence of many great thieves in the city. Finally, a London wizard named Brigden Bray, who had been visited by thieves 19 times in 2 weeks, became so intolerant that he invented the Anti-Alohomoria spell, and the fiasco subsided. Since then, almost all wizarding families have used this spell to lock their doors, and you can only open the door of a wizard with an Alohomora spell that is much more powerful than the caster of the Anti-Alohomora spell. Otherwise, you can only use more violent methods to break it, such as an explosive spell or other spells. This point of knowledge was mentioned in Professor Flitwick's class, but Fish was sleeping at the time. The book Standard Spells, Elemental also mentions the origin of the Alohomora spell and its counterspell in its documentation, but Fish only read how it was cast, and was not interested in anything else. So now he had no idea why his spell had failed. Was there nothing wrong with the steps or the spell? Raising his wand in his hand, Fish again used the spell on the window. Alohomora. Meow. The window remained intact. Although under the influence of the World Tree Shard, Fish's amount of magic was far greater than that of most of the younger wizards at Hogwarts, and even some of the less gifted adult wizards were not as good as him, there was still a considerable distance between him and a veteran wizard like Professor McGonagall, who had been a genius since she was a little girl. And given Fish's nature, he had learned the spell and discarded it without further practice and research, and certainly could not have gotten through Professor McGonagall's carefully arranged counterspell. The eagle owl cocked its head, its large yellow-orange eyes looking at Fish, and let out a questioning hoot. Fish pursed his lips, put away his wand, which had done nothing, and reached out with both hands to grasp the window frame. And strength bulls brute strength wild power. Meow. With the power of the 3 Druid spells, Fish easily ripped out the entire window. The spells that had appeared in his mind worked better. Tossing the window aside, Fish clapped his hands, nodded in satisfaction, and took the owl home. Chapter 36, It's Not a Crime If You Don't Get Caught. Yahoo meow, excited to be home, Fish ran to his room and threw himself on the bed without taking off his shoes. He grabbed onto the sheets, rolled to the other side of the bed and managed to fall, dragging the bed stuff with him to the floor, then rolled back under the bed, wrapped in a heap. Coo, the eagle owl that had perched on the bed let out a hoot, interrupting Fish's merriment. Meow? Ah! I forgot. Fish struggled out from under the covers and looked at the owl that had perched on the bed, then remembered that he had promised to bring food to the owl named Austin. After moving his arms and legs and finding himself a bit tangled, Fish simply shifted into his cat form. After shrinking down and out of the tangle of blankets and sheets, Fish led Austin straight to the kitchen. Once in the kitchen, Fish ran to a tall wooden cabinet, jumped up and grabbed one side of the door with his paws, then stepped on the side with his hind legs and used the reaction force to open the door. This is where the McGonagalls used to store all their food, but now there was nothing there. Meow. Oh my go. Fish jumped into the closet and looked around. The smell of food was still there, but it was really gone. After jumping out of the cupboard, Fish remembered to change to his adult form and opened all the cupboards and drawers in the kitchen, but he still couldn't find any food, only bottles and jars with strange tasting powders. Yuck, gross. Fish chose the most delicious cinnamon powder and licked it, but the taste was really unpleasant. Thinking better of it, he grabbed a handful of cinnamon from the jar and poured it into the pot. He remembered the use of the flu powder. Cooking certainly didn't make any difference. Cuckoo, Austin could see that Fish had run out of food, and seeing the mess he had made in the kitchen, he was worried about being scolded and spoke up. Don't worry, we'll be back before dawn, and no one will know I've done this, Fish replied confidently. The kitten's logic was that if he didn't get caught, he couldn't be blamed for the trouble. There was nothing in the kitchen, but Fish didn't give up. Didn't he still have the snacks Minerva had bought for him? They wouldn't be in the kitchen. As for why he didn't go through the snacks, wasn't it because Fish was a little reluctant? But now he had no choice but to give Austin some of his snacks. Fish ran to the door of Professor McGonagall's room, not bothering to use the Alohomora spell, and ripped off the doorknob, just as he had done with the window. Finding his way through Professor McGonagall's room and finding the place where she had hidden his snacks, Fish opened the cupboard and there was a pile of snacks that Minerva had used to tempt him. In fact, he had found this place a long time ago, but Fish had thought that Minerva would give it to him anyway, so he hadn't come to cause trouble, and since Minerva and Comey were there, it would be easy to get caught. Which one do you want? Asked Fish, turning to Austin. He'd had dinner earlier and been fed by his classmates in the common room and didn't feel much like eating at the moment, so he was generous enough to let Austin choose. Cuckoo. Austin cocked his head to one side for a moment and then pecked at a bag of nuts in the corner of the cupboard. Meow. Do you like these? Although due to the possible influence of the World Tree Shard, Fish wasn't averse to vegetarian food, but his feline nature dictated that he preferred meat, not to mention that the herbaceous smell of nuts was relatively faint, so he had never been too interested in them. Seeing that Austin liked them, Fish gave him the whole bag of nuts with great generosity. Here you go, it's all yours, don't even mention it. Meow. Austin flew to the table with the bag of nuts in his mouth, opened it with his claws and beak and began to enjoy the nuts inside. Fish picked up a licorice wand, transformed back into his cat form, carried it out of the room and began frolicking around the house. He would sharpen his paws on the wooden furniture, push everything on the table onto the floor, climb on the curtains, walk around with anything that caught his eye and then toss it into a corner. This was Fish's usual routine in the house, except that Comey used to be there to take care of things. Now there was no one to take care of Fish. But Fish wasn't worried about that, as long as he escaped before he was discovered. Having turned the whole house upside down, a satisfied Fish lay down on his side on the living room floor and rested. Minerva would be furious if she found out. Fish surveyed the mess and thought. But, she's not here now, no one will know what I did. The thought of not finding the thief when Minerva would return made Fish so happy that he let out a loud purr of pleasure in his throat. Just as Fish was enjoying himself, the door to the villa opened with a bang and an anxious Professor McGonagall burst in from outside. The house was such an important memory to Professor McGonagall that she had put an alarm spell on it, in addition to an Anti-Alohomora opening spell. When the alarm spell informed her of the intrusion into her house, Professor McGonagall, who had overslept, came running from Hogwarts without even changing out of her pajamas. But upon seeing the little tabby cat lying in the middle of the living room, and the familiar typhoon scene surrounding it, the anxiety on Professor McGonagall's face disappeared, replaced by anger and disbelief. Fish. Meow. Omega. Fish was stunned to see Professor McGonagall appear in front of him. How had Minerva returned so suddenly? But now was not the time to think about it, and with a jolt, Fish got up from the ground, waving his forepaws and trying to escape. How dare you run! A furious Minerva waved her wand and turned the fallen furniture and overturned utensils around her into a swarm of cats. They pounced on Fish and quickly pinned him down as he tried to escape. Professor McGonagall stood in front of Fish and glared at him. Meow. Even though he knew it would probably be useless, Fish made a pitiful face. How dare you act pitiful! Professor McGonagall laughed angrily as she waved her hand to scatter the cats. Transform and speak. Minerva, you're back. Meow. The humanoid fish hugged Professor McGonagall, burying his head in his arms and rubbing herself to please her. Don't act like nothing happened. Professor McGonagall pulled Fish's head away and then smacked him hard on the head. Tell me. How the hell did you get back? Austin sent me back. Meow. Fish answered honestly, covering his head. Austin. Professor McGonagall was still trying to remember who at school was named Austin when she saw a very familiar eagle owl come down from the second floor, one of the public owls that Hogwarts had, and that she had actually seen several times in the Oloi. Whether it was named Austin or Aria, Professor McGonagall wasn't quite sure, as it wasn't the owl she usually used. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that she finally knew how Fish had gotten home from Hogwarts. Although Professor McGonagall was somewhat pleased that Fish was no longer owl hunting, she hadn't forgotten her duties as a teacher. 50 points off for Gryffindor and you'll be confined for a week. Meow. What's confinement? The point reduction didn't bother Fish, he was more interested in the new word that had appeared. Professor McGonagall smiled faintly. You'll know tomorrow. Now. Clean house with me. No. Meow. Chapter 37, Your Name. The next day, when Hermione Granger woke up and discovered that Fish was not in the common room, she ran to the great dining hall with the others. It was only when she reached the great dining hall that she found Percy Weasley and the study group gathered in the foyer, where the hourglass of house points stood, talking about something. Hermione hurried over to them. What's going on? She asked. You can see for yourself. Percy sighed helplessly and pointed to the Gryffindor hourglass. The ruby representing the score was quite a bit lower than before dinner yesterday. It was 50 points short. Oh my god, what happened last night? Exclaimed Hermione, covering her forehead. How was it possible that her study group had worked so hard to get house points and beat other houses, only for the score gap to become larger in one night? I don't know, Percy continued bitterly. I heard from Harry and the others that Fish didn't seem to be in his dorm last night, and we didn't see him in the morning. Although Percy didn't say it explicitly, everyone knew what he meant, that the 50 points could only be deducted for Fish. The Gryffindor wizards were used to this sort of thing, but this time it was just a slightly bigger deduction. No big deal. They were more worried about the fact that Fish hadn't come back last night. Just when they were all worried that something had happened to Fish, the Hogwarts doors burst open and a serious-looking Professor McGonagall walked in with Fish. Meow. Everyone's here. A heartless Fish gleefully greeted the Gryffindors gathered in the great dining hall. Professor McGonagall glared at the brat and then addressed Hermione and the others sternly. What are you all doing here? Don't you have classes in the morning? Seeing that Professor McGonagall was in a bad mood, they all dispersed and returned to the long Gryffindor table for breakfast. Go eat breakfast and remember to go to class after lunch. After sending the Gryffindors off to eat, Professor McGonagall nudged Fish. Also, meet me and Mr. Filch in the great dining hall at 9 o'clock tonight. Got it, meow. You're a nuisance, Minerva. Fish, who had no idea what confinement was, waved his hand moodily and hurried towards the long Gryffindor table. He had been caught by Minerva the night before, and hadn't even run to the kitchen to get food from Comey and the others, so his stomach was already growling with hunger. Fish, are you okay? As Fish approached the long table, the little wizards around him approached him. What can I do? Fish picked up the chop the little witch had cut off and stuffed a piece in his mouth with a puzzled look on his face. What happened last night? Did Professor McGonagall catch you? Harry and the others said you didn't come back to the dormitory last night. Hermione, who was already full of questions, blurted out a string of words that the others couldn't even understand. Luckily, she was asking the questions everyone wanted to know, so no one had any trouble with her. Last night, meow. Gulping down the food in his mouth, Fish said truthfully, I rode Austin to Hogsmeade last night and Minerva caught me and she's going to confine me for a week, starting tonight. Although Fish himself seemed unconcerned, the others didn't seem so, and they instantly started talking. Confinement? That's not good. Fred, one of the twins, was blunt. Filch might make you clean the toilets. Fish and Filch seem to be on good terms, you won't be given much work. George wasn't too concerned. His attention was focused on something else. Did you go to Hogsmeade last night? Did you take a secret passage? Didn't Fish say he was going to ride Austin? Ron had been given a hard time by his two brothers the night before, and he took the opportunity to sneer. Who's Austin, by the way? Austin is an owl I met yesterday afternoon in the upper room of the West Tower. Replied Fish, patting his tummy after breakfast. When he said that, it made sense to everyone, but Hermione, who was known as Miss Know-It-All, suddenly found a blind spot. Wait, so, you can remember people's names? Just because Hermione wasn't offended that Fish had given her a nickname, didn't mean she liked it, or rather, that no girl would like a nickname like Rat Teeth. Meow. Omega? Fish cocked his head in confusion. I can always remember, Rat Teeth is Hermione Granger, Scarhead is Harry Potter, Redhead 1, 2, 3, 4 are Percy, Fred, George, and Ron Weasley. Fish pointed them out one by one, even the twins Fred and George, whose names he had not confused, which was no easy task knowing that not even his mother could tell which one was which. However, it wasn't a problem for Fish. With his keen sense of smell and Druid's instinctive animal perception, the difference between the two was really quite obvious. After giving the nicknames and names of everyone around him, Fish raised his chin and proudly said, Fish has a smart head. Omega. And you still call me Rat Teeth? Exclaimed Hermione frantically, scratching her long, thick hair. Don't you call me Fish too? Said Fish. Hey? What's your name if not Fish? Hermione was stunned, not quite sure what Fish was referring to. No, meow no. Fish shook his head like a rattle. My name should be Meow. Fish is a nickname translated from his human language. Hermione didn't know what to say to Fish when he looked at him with such conviction. And even though she was an expert, she still didn't know anything about cat language. Ha 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 ha. What does it matter if we call you Rat Teeth? Isn't that a cute nickname? Our nickname is still a number. George reached out and patted Hermione on the shoulder, laughing and reassuring her. With a grimace at George, Hermione knew there was no point in arguing further with Fish, who was clearly still thinking in terms of cats. So she willingly gave up her seat next to Fish and turned to discuss with Percy and the others how to make up the 50 points that had been deducted the night before. But this problem didn't matter much to Hermione either, since today's first-year lesson was only 2 morning potions lessons, and it was impossible for Hermione to get points, in terms of not losing points. Hermione looked at Harry, and then at Neville and Seamus. Obviously, that was impossible as well. Then it's up to you, Hermione said in a heavy tone to Percy and the other seniors. Fish, who was wolfing down his food, twitched his ears and suddenly looked at Hermione and the others, who were discussing how to get as many points as possible. Meow. Although Fish had never had a concrete idea of what house points were, after hearing so much talk about them, he was a little worried. However, just as he was about to ask about house points, a young witch picked up a piece of fried fish and popped it into his mouth. Fish, ah. Meow, 0. With the food ready, Fish didn't mind the house points and swallowed the fish in his mouth. Ah, Katie, you're taking advantage. The other witches were not happy and joined in, feeding Fish. Ugh, envy. The boys, who had seen this scene many times before, sighed again in unison. After a rowdy breakfast, the Gryffindor first years headed off to their least favorite class, potions. Except, of course, for one special member, Fish. Hello. Fish, the first to enter the potions classroom, greeted Snape and the Slytherin students with a cheerful smile. Snape merely ignored Fish, while the Slytherins returned a reserved smile. As Fish took his seat, the Gryffindors filed in, and Professor Snape's eyes sharpened as soon as Harry took his first step into the classroom. He wouldn't bother Fish, but he wouldn't let the rest of the Gryffindors off the hook either, especially Harry Potter, whom he both loved and hated. Then Snape began frantically targeting other Gryffindor students with the malicious intent of deducing Gryffindor House. In particular, Harry, the enemy's son and Snape's lover, was so irritated that he nearly got into a fight with Snape, but Ron was quick enough to stop him. But he and Ron were also caught by Snape and had 5 points deducted from each of them. 2 hard potions lessons later, the Gryffindors' already poor points got worse. After class, the Gryffindors fled the classroom in disarray, making sure they were out of Snape's sight before heading to the great dining hall, cursing. Chapter 38, Confinement. The indignation of the Gryffindors was not something Fish could relate to, but he had a vague idea of what to expect when, at lunchtime, the multitude of curses spread from the first years to the long Gryffindor tables. Incidentally, he also remembered the question he had wanted to ask in the morning. Is that score important? Fish turned to Parvati. If he remembered correctly, it seemed that Minerva had subtracted a lot of those so-called house points from his. After a week of being pampered by everyone, Fish, who had come to understand human ways, was not so ungrateful and had an apologetic look on his face. Of course, it was impossible to make him change now, but at best, Fish decided to run away faster when he got into trouble and try not to get caught. Actually, it's not that important. Fish's answer was not given by Parvati, but by an older girl sitting next to him. While some, like Percy Weasley, are more interested in house points, most Gryffindors don't care that much. Patricia Stinson shook her head, her ponytail swaying slightly behind her head, causing Fish to feel the urge to pounce on her. Of the 4 houses, Gryffindor students are the most rule-breaking, and even without Snape, the house cup is basically out of our hands. Patricia, who hadn't noticed Fish's little thoughts, shrugged and explained. It's just that Slytherin has won 6 in a row, and the other 3 houses are in the same boat. Seeing Fish staring at her, Patricia became slightly agitated and, as she spoke, increased her body movements, and the ponytail at the nape of her neck continued to flutter. After taking a sip of pumpkin juice to moisten her throat, Patricia continued, I've actually analyzed. Well, from my Ravenclaw friends, that even without Snape, Slytherin has the best chance of winning the House Cup. After a few seconds of hesitation, Patricia didn't feel like stealing from the others and repeated the analysis she had heard. The Gryffindor students were too nervous, scoring as many points as they were taking away. Although Hufflepuff had a large number of students, but their average ability was not very high and they did not score well. Ravenclaw are mostly unconcerned about the world and don't take the House Cup very seriously, preferring to spend their time doing things that interest them. Only Slytherin, focused on honor and victory, is the most passionate about the cup, and with a protective head, it's no wonder they've won 6 in a row. The ponytail in front of him blurted out a bunch of words that Fish didn't understand, mostly because ponytails on the back of the neck were very appealing to cats. Anyway, it meant that it didn't matter if they subtracted points, which Fish did understand. As for the grey-headed Slytherin, didn't it seem logical to Fish that he favored his students? Fish himself was one of the most favored, so he had no problem with that. But there was one thing he didn't understand. If what you want is for the big brain house not to win, Fish asked innocently, looking away from the pigtail, then why don't you drag them in and deduct points together? As long as the students in the big brain house earn points, even if they deduct points from us, they'll be deducted together, right? The clever kitten picked up on the clue right away. After throwing out the question, Fish continued to stare at the ponytail on the back of Patricia's head, and took the food that Parvati had cut up for him off his plate and popped it into his mouth. Since Fish hadn't lowered his voice, several people had heard him, including Fred and George, 2 troublemakers. Why didn't we come up with that idea, redhead number 2? Said Fred. It's not too late to find out, redhead number 3, said George. The twins looked at each other and then laughed mischievously. Lee Jordan and the 2, who shared their bad taste, quickly got together and began discussing how to turn Fish's proposal into something practical. Filch had no idea what a stir his casual remark would cause the Gryffindor lions. Even if he did know, he wouldn't have cared. After quickly filling his stomach, Filch got up and left the castle. There were no classes in Gryffindor on Friday afternoons and Filch liked to sleep in the sun on the lawn outside the castle, and since tomorrow was a double day off, there was plenty of time to play with Filch since no one was busy catching up on homework. After another lazy afternoon, Filch returned to the drawing room for dinner and found the place a bit of a mess. George and Fred were confronting a group of Slytherins in the great dining hall with a group of Gryffindors, and judging by their increasingly agitated expressions and the curses coming out of their mouths, it looked like a fight was about to break out. This was a familiar situation for Filch, from his time as a stray, when other stray cats and dogs would fight. So he walked over to a stool and prepared to watch the action. Phi Omega Phi. The two warring sides didn't keep Filch waiting long. A spell soon flew from the Slytherin side, hitting the more cursing Lee Jordan with a pair of huge teeth that quickly blocked his expletives to the rap rhythm of his throat. The Gryffindors weren't going to be left behind, or rather, they were prepared, and as soon as the Slytherin spell went flying, 5 or 6 wands were raised and a bunch of little spells were launched towards the Slytherin side. It was only because Fred and the others were worried about beating the Slytherins in such a way that they would lose points to them that they didn't all do it at once. The Slytherins didn't sit still, but fought back after a moment of stupefied silence, and the great dining hall was filled with shouts and colorful spells flying back and forth. Filch's eyes followed the ribbons of light flying in the sky, as his little head whipped from side to side, degree omega degree 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 omega degree. It was fun to watch people fight, but they were too stupid to dodge the spells. The professors could not have been unaware of the commotion in the great dining hall, not to mention that they came to the great dining hall for dinner, which was one of the reasons Fred and the others had chosen to fight here, and Snape was always late for the great dining hall. Just as Filch watched the chickens pecking at each other, a blinding golden light burst over the auditorium, accompanied by a loud noise that stopped the little wizards from attacking each other. What's going on? The first to arrive was Professor McGonagall, who, as vice principal, was so dedicated to her duties that she came as quickly as she could as soon as she heard what was happening in the auditorium. She was relieved to see that Filch was only on the sidelines, as before she arrived she had thought Filch had caused trouble again. Soon, however, Professor McGonagall's face was angry again. A group fight in the great dining hall, no student had ever done that before. 20 points for Slytherin and Gryffindor. Now who's going to tell me why? I know. Minerva. I know. Filch ran up and happily recounted the conversation that had taken place at the Gryffindor table at lunchtime to Professor McGonagall, then looked at his with wide eyes and an expectant look. Minerva, did I help you? What's the reward? At home, Professor McGonagall had always rewarded Filch with a small snack or toy whenever she helped in any way, whether out of the goodness of her heart or not. Hoo. Professor McGonagall took a deep breath to keep from fainting as she shouted to the now desperate twins, another 20 points off for Gryffindor. George, Fred. You two. You're both confined with Filch tonight. Not that Professor McGonagall was selfish and didn't want to deduct more, but Gryffindor's points weren't enough. Filch, who didn't understand the situation, still threw up his hands and begged Professor McGonagall for a reward with sparkling eyes. Minerva, what about the reward? Chapter 39, How can there be such a big difference in the treatment of the same fellow inmates? At 8:50 p.m., Fred and George emerged from the Gryffindor dormitory with a sigh and made their way to the first-floor foyer, followed by a cheerful Filch. This is Minerva's initiative to let me out for the night. When the confinement is over, we'll go to the kitchen to get food from Comey and the others. Filch licked his lips unconsciously and made plans in his mind with glee. Fred and George looked at Filch, who still had no idea what was in store for him, and sighed again in unison. They didn't think Filch would betray them. After all, he was still a bit young and it was understandable that he would do something unexpected, and he was so handsome that there was no need for him to be bothered about such a small thing. Of course it was only Filch, but if it had been his good brother Ronnie or his good brother the prefect, the two of them would have doubled their revenge. The three of them went downstairs and saw the 4 large hourglasses by the main doors, showing the points for each house, and once again the twins sighed helplessly as they saw that there were only a few Gryffindor rubies left. This time, their plan had gone wrong, and a mere 20 points had not been enough to knock Slytherin out of first place, and they had drained the last of Gryffindor's assets. However, Gryffindor was originally last place and there was no difference between 0 and 100. The two brothers looked at each other and consoled themselves with self-deception. They descended the stairs to the grand dining hall on the first floor, where a stern-faced Professor McGonagall awaited them. accompanied by Hogwarts caretaker Filch and his cat, Mrs. Norris. Upon seeing the Weasley twins, Filch looked at them with his big eyes and gave them both a creepy smile. "You two, at last, are in my hands." The twins read it in Filch's expression. Fred and George shuddered and felt desperate at the thought of the feud between them and Filch over the past 2 years. There was no telling what Filch would do to them next. Stiffly, the twins greeted Professor McGonagall grumpily. "Professor McGonagall." Fish, for his part, was as energetic as ever. "Minerva. I'm coming, meow. Hurry up with the confinement, I have to find Comey in the kitchen later." "Phi Omega Phi." Professor McGonagall snorted, shot a vicious look at the little cat, and then said to the janitor next to her, "Filch, I'll leave them to you." Filch's job was to arrange punishments for the students, and the righteous Professor McGonagall wasn't about to overstep her authority. She was only here to make sure Fish had come to accept his punishment obediently. The question of whether Filch would be merciful to Fish had been overlooked, as Filch had a terrible reputation among the students. And since Filch had met Fish on the first night of class and had informed the other teachers that he had been partying, Professor McGonagall had unconsciously dismissed that possibility. "Leave it in my hands, Professor McGonagall." Filch's eyes stayed on the Weasley twins, his smile widening to show his white teeth. "I'll make sure they have a night to remember." Professor McGonagall nodded in satisfaction and then shot another warning glance at Fish before leaving the foyer and heading for her office. Upon seeing Professor McGonagall leave, the good boy, Fish, immediately reverted to his bouncy nature and leapt in front of Filch in 2 strides. To be precise, he leapt towards Mrs. Norris. "Meow." Mrs. Norris walked over to Filch and rubbed her head against his calf. Fish bent down and picked Mrs. Norris up in his arms, then gently touched her forehead with the tip of his nose as a gesture of friendship. "Meow." After greeting his best friend, Fish looked up at Filch. "Hello, Big Eyes, so you've come to take me to confinement?" Filch's facial expression instantly changed from frightened to affable as the twins looked on in horror, nodding at Fish. "Yes, that's my job." With a soft smile on his face that the other students had never seen before, he conversed with Fish amiably. Fred rubbed his eyes hard and repeatedly until they were red, and nothing changed. George, for his part, pinched his thighs hard, but couldn't wake up from that unreal dream. Even though they already knew that Fish and Filch were on good terms, this was too much. "Fred, I suspect I may have inadvertently eaten psychedelic mushrooms at dinner," said George. "That's amazing, George, because I had the same feeling you did," said Fred. The two brothers had to accept the dreamlike reality after confirming with each other over and over again, that this Filch could be so kind to a student. Even if it was dear Fish, this was too much to take in. "You two, come with me." After finishing talking to Fish, Filch raised the oil lamp in his hand, returned to his dead face and said coldly to George and Fred. George and Fred were relieved to see that Filch was still treating them so coldly, for the kindly face he had just put on was so out of place that they suspected they had been under the imperious curse. Fish followed Filch with Mrs. Norris in his arms, and Fred and George, still in a trance, stared at him for a few moments before following him with incredulous faces. Filch led the 3 of them into the potions classroom, which was filled with 5 huge cauldrons, filled with some sort of blue insects that reflected a brilliant lapis lazuli glow in the light of the oil lamps. "You're in luck," Filch's chagrined voice rang in the twins' ears. "Professor Snape needs a lot of billywig stingers for next week's class, but he's been very busy with other things lately, so he needs 2 people to get these stingers out of the billywig's body. Even though the bugs are dead, I have to warn you that even with the billywig bugs dead, the effects of their stings are still there, and if you don't want to spend the next few days delirious, or even floating in the air, you'd better get gloves on." The regret in Filch's voice was audible. If he could, Filch wouldn't even want to warn the Weasleys about the pesky twins, but if anything went wrong with the 2 of them due to his deliberate concealment, Dumbledore would hold him responsible as well. So, albeit reluctantly, Filch relayed Professor Snape's instructions in all sincerity. After assigning the twins their tasks, Filch turned his head and resumed his gentle smile. "As for you, Fish, Mrs. Loris has lost her appetite a bit lately, so I'd like you to take her to the kitchen, find her something appetizing to eat, and lastly, make sure you're back here by 12. Meow. No problem." Fish slapped his chest. "I've got this." With that said, he led Mrs. Norris out of the classroom, muttering as he went, "I like the confinement thing, meow." With gloves on, Fred and George looked at the dense mass of billywig bugs before them. "We like that kind of confinement, too." Chapter 40, I didn't expect it. While the Weasley twins were laboriously plucking Billywig stingers in the potions classroom, Fish was in the kitchen eating and drinking, led by Comey, a group of house elves who had become veteran cat slaves and surrounded Fish and Mrs. Norris to serve the two cats. After they had eaten and drunk, Fish decided to go for his usual walk, while Mrs. Norris liked to go for a walk every night to help Filch catch the night students. So the two cats left the kitchen and wandered around Hogwarts. But the two cats had different routes to take. Fish likes to roam and wreak havoc, crawling into armor, getting under statues and leaving claw marks in the wood, or sneaking into unoccupied classrooms and pushing things off desks onto the floor, which Comey and the others will have restored by dawn anyway. Mrs. Norris, on the other hand, wanted to catch the students on a night out, basically wandering from hallway to hallway, or snooping around the various dormitories in the houses and the entrances and exits to some secret corridors. So it didn't take long for the two cats to disperse, moving into their own areas of interest. On the first floor, Fish won't be staying long. Although Madame Pomfrey at the school hospital often gives him snacks, the defense against the dark arts classroom is also here, and the lingering garlic smell inside couldn't be stopped even with the doors closed. And what's more, Minerva's office was also on the first floor, and Fish didn't want to get caught. His confinement was to take Mrs. Norris to the kitchen for lunch, and if Minerva found out he'd snuck out of the kitchen, she'd be back to scold him, so he'd better stay away. Near the staircase on the first floor is the stinky guy's office, and the smell is stronger on the second floor, so Fish just skipped it. On the third floor, down the hallway to the left, was the awards showroom, with all kinds of trophies, perfect for a cat's nest, and every now and then I'd go in for a nap or something. However, Fish wasn't sleepy at the moment, so he had no intention of going in for the time being. As Fish made his way to the fourth floor, he heard a footstep in the hallway to his right. Fish flapped his ears as two footsteps came, one of them soft, probably from Professor Greasehead, and the other loud, from none other than the big man, Hagrid. Whoever it was, Fish didn't want to be seen now, so he quickly sought a corner and hid. He watched from around the corner as Snape strode down the corridor like a black cloud, followed by Hagrid, who was striding forward at none too quick strides. Fish remained hidden in the dark corner, waiting for the sound of the two men's footsteps to fade before running off again. Meow, Fish turned his gaze in the direction the two were coming from. He had also passed by that place when he was touring the entire castle before, but in his impression it looked like there was only a very common wooden door there, and he had left after a quick glance, thinking it didn't hold much interest. As for Dumbledore's mention of staying away from her at the beginning of the term, Fish was sleeping at the time and didn't hear him. But now, he was intrigued by Snape and Hagrid. With small, light steps he reached the wooden door at the end of the corridor, and Fish wiggled his little pink nose. Behind the door there was a faint stench, a bit like that of a dog. Then Fish flicked his ears again and heard a strange snoring behind the door. There were 3 snores, but the frequency of the snores was exactly the same. Alohomora. Curious, Fish pulled out his wand and fired an Alohomora spell at the wooden door in front of him. As before, the door didn't respond at all. Meow. It's not working, Fish cursed under his breath as he tapped his wand against the floor. After looking at the wand for a moment, Fish picked it up. After all, it was the spell that was useless and he still liked the wand. Putting the wand away, Fish walked over and gripped the door frame with both hands. Meow. I guess I'll have to tear it off. Pushing aside the wooden door, Fish smacked his hands together with satisfaction and then stretched his head to look inside. Behind the door was a large black dog with 3 heads, which had been making the snoring noises, but had already been awakened by all the commotion Fish had made. Meow, Fish was startled by the big dog in front of him. He was familiar with dogs, but this was the first time he had seen a dog with 3 heads, and he was envious of how big it had grown. Hello, Meow. Fish trotted over to the 3-headed dog and bowed his little head in greeting. Woof. ×3. The 3-headed dog responded immediately, then bent his 3 heads down and tried to lick Fish's face. Don't lick me, Meow. Fish backed up 2 steps and slapped his middle head on the nose. Dogs had so much drool, and it stank so much. Fish never really liked being licked by dogs, especially when the dog in front of him was so big that he drooled even more. Ooh, the slap wasn't hard, but the 3-headed dog still cringed and let out a whimper of aggression. You drool too much, I don't hate you, Meow. Understanding the 3-headed dog's aggravation, Fish stood on his tiptoes to pet the dog's snout twice, apologizing for the slap he had just delivered. The 3-headed dog that was immediately comforted bent down and placed the 3 large heads in front of Fish. Fish simply turned back into a cat and jumped on his middle head. The cat and the dog exchanged meow meow and woof 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 woof. This made Dumbledore, who was eavesdropping on the sidelines, very frustrated, because he couldn't understand. And after Fish communicated with the three-headed dog for a while, it stepped aside, exposing the flap door beneath him. Dumbledore's heart squeezed. This multi-level was not only set up for him to catch Voldemort, but also to train Harry Potter as the savior, and it was not impossible for Fish to get through it, but only if he teamed up with Harry. But what happened next was a relief to Dumbledore. After showing Fish the trapdoor, the three-headed dog covered him up again, and no matter how much Fish meowed, pawed at his head, and bit his ears, the three-headed dog stayed at the trapdoor and didn't move. Hagrid's animals were very loyal. A relieved Dumbledore stroked his beard and smiled as he watched Fish intimidate the three-headed dog. Meow. I'm outta here. I'm pissed. When the three-headed dog stubbornly refused to let him into the trapdoor, Fish gave it 2 more paws and jumped off its head, intent on leaving. There was still time to come back later, and according to Fish's own biological clock, it was almost 12 o'clock, and he had to remember to send Mrs. Norris with jumping eyes. Woof, woof. ×3. The three-headed dog waved goodbye to Fish with all 3 heads at once, wagging his tail as fast as he could. After leaving the room at the end of the 3rd-floor hallway, Fish wandered around the area that Mrs. Norris often patrolled and soon found her, and the 2 cats rubbed against each other before heading to the potions classroom together. On the way they met Peeves, but the mischievous one took one look at Fish and walked away, cursing because he knew he couldn't scare this little cat. The 2 cats made it back to the potions classroom safely, and Fish, in human form, entered. Fred and George were still struggling to pull Billywig's stingers out, while Filch and Professor McGonagall watched them. Meow? Minerva? Fish looked a little wary when he saw Professor McGonagall, but he soon caught on. I'm here to complete my confinement, so what's the point of feeling guilty? A smile appeared on Fish's face as he ran to Professor McGonagall's side. Minerva. My confinement is complete. The confinement was fun. Fish hugged Professor McGonagall and moved his little head to rub up against her. Hearing this, Professor McGonagall twisted the corners of her mouth, thinking it was a good thing she had cared enough to take a look, otherwise she wouldn't have known that Filch, a guy with big eyebrows and big eyes, was giving Fish special treatment. With a furious look, Filch turned his head shyly, not daring to meet Professor McGonagall's gaze. However, Professor McGonagall had no intention of pursuing him. After all, Filch was well within his rights to assign whatever homework he wanted, and even if he had the sense to give a student a break, that was his freedom. Professor McGonagall herself wanted to take this opportunity to teach Fish a lesson, but she never expected that even Filch, who had a bad reputation among the student body, would change his ways and be nice to him. Well, how bad can a cat lover be? Professor McGonagall looked at Filch, who was scratching Mrs. Norris's chin, and came to this conclusion very subjectively. But then, in this way, Filch's confinement cannot be left to Filch. Professor McGonagall looked at Fish. Now that you have finished your confinement for the day, why don't you go back to bed? After dismissing Fish, she turned to Filch and said, starting tomorrow, I will confirm Fish's confinement, so keep an eye on the 2 Weasleys. You should. Seeing that Professor McGonagall had no intention of pursuing him, Filch smiled and nodded. As for what would happen to Fish next, Filch could only say regretfully that there was nothing he could do. Meow. Omega? Fish looked at the 2 in confusion, not understanding what they were talking about. Chapter 41, Ron has disappeared. Harry. Get up. We have to go to Quidditch team tryouts. Ron came to Harry's bedside early Saturday morning, shaking him awake with great force. Oh, Harry Potter hurriedly put on his glasses and sat up in his bed. What's the selection test? Neville asked curiously. He hadn't done very well in flying lessons and had never considered making the Quidditch team. But still, Neville had come from a wizarding family, and when he heard the word Quidditch, he couldn't help but pay attention. The Gryffindor Quidditch team is short a seeker, and due to Fish's previous performance, Wood is looking at the first years to see if there are any other suitable candidates for the Quidditch team, and to get some replacements and reserves. It was Seamus Finnegan who answered Neville, who was holding a shoe over his foot and, judging by the situation, it was obvious that he was also planning to join in the fun. Dean, are you going too? Neville looked at Dean Thomas, who was also up and changing, and if he remembered correctly, Dean had recently fallen out with Ron over which was more fun in the Muggle world, soccer or Quidditch. I'm just going with Seamus and the others, to see what all the fuss is about. Dean shrugged as he changed and waved to Neville. Neville, aren't you coming? If only to cheer Harry and the others up. Neville thought better of it and got out of bed. Squirming back into the pillow, Fish opened one eye to look at the noisy housemates, flicked his little ears and went back to sleep. Omega Phi equals. Not to mention his lack of interest in Quidditch, Professor McGonagall had forbidden Fish to touch a flying broom, and this team selection had nothing to do with him in the first place. Harry and the others were aware of Fish's situation, so they didn't disturb the sleeping kitten, got dressed and headed to the great dining room for breakfast. As for taking food to Fish, it was none of their business to take food to Fish, who was never short of it. Harry and the others finished breakfast in the great dining hall and headed to the Quidditch pitch, where Wood had gotten permission from Professor McGonagall for the day. Not only did she sign the permission, but even Professor McGonagall had come in person, but she was worried that her presence might affect the students' performance, so she didn't show up for the time being. Apart from the new students, there were also several Gryffindors from other years who came to the pitch, as did Dean, to watch the tryouts, but not to participate in them. If they had the ability to do so, they would have been put on Wood's team by now, otherwise, why wait until now? The only first-year students attending the auditions were Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Seamus Finnegan, and in the case of the girls, there was only Lavender Brown among the first years. Muggle-born Hermione Granger had little interest in Quidditch and preferred to spend her time in the library. Parvati Patil, on the other hand, came from a place where flying carpets were more popular and flying brooms, let alone Quidditch, were rare, and although Parvati had been exposed to some Quidditch culture since moving to England, she had been influenced by her native culture and had very little interest in Quidditch. Let's test who's a better seeker. Wood handed out flying brooms to the three of them and some of the regulars on the team, before pulling a snitch out of his pocket. The only thing the Gryffindor team lacked at the moment was a seeker. If they could find one among the first years, that would be best. If not, one of them would have to be chosen from George and the others, and then the first years would have to fill the void. After all, in Quidditch, finding a player was so important, not only for scoring the most points, but also for determining the end of a match, that it had to be the top priority. Now, get on your brooms, said Wood. At Wood's command, Harry and the others climbed onto their brooms and slowly rose into the air. Wood released the golden snitch in his hand and saw a flash of golden light, and they all lost track of it in an instant. The selection has begun. The crowd in the sky immediately dispersed, looking for the snitch. Meow. As Harry and the others wandered around the sky, Fish, lying on his pillow, straightened his limbs, bent backwards into an arc and stretched with a cheerful laziness, slowly coming out of his slumber. Sitting up on the pillow, he licked his paws slowly and rubbed his face repeatedly for a few moments before shaking out his mustache and jumping off the bed. Wagging his tail mindlessly, he contemplated where he would go to play today. As for food, he was in no hurry, as anyone he encountered would offer him food as soon as he left. At Hogwarts, or rather anywhere there were humans, Fish didn't have to worry about food. Meow. One of Fish's ears suddenly turned toward Ron's bed, followed by his head, and his little pink nose twitched twice. It was the scent of a mouse. Hadn't red-headed number 4 taken his mouse? This was a bit odd, as Ron was always on guard against Fish, in case he accidentally killed Scabbers. Bah! Red-headed number 4 underestimates me. Fish is so understanding. Remembering how wary Ron had been of him when it came to Scabbers, Fish wagged his tail in disgust. Without thinking, he jumped onto Ron's bunk and grabbed the fat mouse's body. Scabbers woke up groggily, feeling like something was weighing him down and he couldn't move, and he rolled his pea-sized eyes to look up, and a familiar, huge cat face appeared. It was Fish, a classmate of Scabbers' teacher Ron, who, like him, was an animagus. Fish was now holding him in his cat form, looking up at him with his slowly widening green pupils. Scabbers. Scabbers struggled as he realized that his only support was not in the bedroom. Meow. Run. Or I'll eat you. Fish let go of his paws and Scabbers jumped like an arrow. Even if Fish hadn't threatened, he wouldn't have dared to lie there like he had when they first met. In Ron's absence, there was no telling if this little wizard, who had been a stray cat for years, would actually eat him. Meow. Run faster. Meow. Run faster. Meow, ha 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 ha. Scabbers, who was struggling to escape, heard the cat's meow behind him, and hated it. If it wasn't for the fear of Dumbledore discovering his presence, he would have reverted to his human form and used an unforgivable curse on the cursed cat behind him. However, Scabbers could only think of such things, and as long as Fish didn't really want to eat him, he would never reveal his identity. But then, he would have to keep running. Since the animagus didn't have any special powers like the Druid transformation spell, Scabbers was, apart from his intelligence, a very healthy and slightly stronger rat. So after a chase, Scabbers was caught by Fish with no problems. After giving Scabbers a couple of pats, Fish let him go and ha! After scaring Scabbers into running again, Fish immediately went after him with great enthusiasm. After being stopped by Redhead number 4 earlier, this time he was going to have fun. Chapter 42, An Invitation from Malfoy. I can't escape. If the little wizard really wants to eat me, I'll risk Dumbledore finding me out, and I'll give him an Avada Kedavra shot. An exhausted Scabbers lay in the corner of the freshman dormitory, chest heaving. Fish gracefully approached Scabbers and gave it the usual 2 swipes, but when it twitched its limbs unconsciously and didn't keep running, he knew that the rat was really exhausted. Meow, I had a good time today, I'll come play with you next time. As Scabbers watched him nervously, Fish lowered his head and licked Scabbers' messy fur, then gave a satisfied meow and left Scabbers, who had almost become human again, alone. Fish turned his head and looked around the room he and Scabbers had messed up. The room had been turned upside down by the combined efforts of cat and mouse. Pillows and bedding had been dragged to the floor or ripped off, and every item on the table had been thrown on the floor. The soccer posters Dean had placed on his bed, the cage Harry had used for Hedwig, the memory ball Neville had forgotten in a corner, and other personal items of his roommates, were damaged in various ways. Meow. I'm in trouble, I have to run. As for taking human form and using magic spells to restore the place to its original state? Sorry, that was never on Fish's list of things to do when he got in trouble. Fish jumped up, put his 2 front claws on the doorknob and opened the door. With the inertia of this flapping, the bedroom door slowly swung open. After Fish landed, he slipped through the crack in the door immediately, and the moment he was out, he lifted his hind legs and kicked the door again. He carefully slid along the wall into the common room, which should have been filled with many people, but was now empty. Most of the Gryffindor students had gone to watch the Quidditch team tryouts, and the few who stayed in the common room were bored for a while, so they scattered to do their own thing. Fish didn't really know what was going on, he just thought he was lucky that no witnesses had seen him leave, and even if Scarhead and the others came back, they wouldn't be sure that the dormitory had been messed up by himself. The cat's thoughts were so innocent and so simple. Leaving the Gryffindor dormitory as fast as he could, Fish threw his 4 paws out and ran downstairs. Besides wanting to get away from the crime scene, he was hungry and wanted to get food from Comey. Fish! Fish was yelling up the stairs when someone called out to him, and he turned to look at. It was Big Brain, and his 2 henchmen, the Big Dweeb, Gregory Goyle, and Chubby, Vincent Crabbe. Draco Malfoy, however, had long since abandoned his big haircut slicked back in favor of a very ordinary 3/7, but even with the ordinary 3/7, he still looked meticulous under Malfoy's grooming. Meow. Fish sat on the stair railing and raised his left paw to greet Malfoy. I had my father get smoked cod from Iceland, I was wondering if you'd be interested in trying it, Malfoy asked in his usual leisurely tone, still in that old-fashioned pure-blood family way even when inviting someone over. But under the influence of his animal affinity, he didn't show his usual superiority in front of Fish. Of course, even if Malfoy had shown it, Fish probably wouldn't have been able to perceive the intricacies of human socialization. Meow. Pure blood in Iceland and all that, Fish knew nothing about it, but he was familiar with the word cod. So, without hesitation, Fish hopped over the stair railing to Malfoy's shoulder and squatted there. Meow. Seeing Malfoy frozen in place, Fish raised his paw and poked him in the face. The startled Malfoy came to his senses. I'll take you there. With a small silver tabby kitten on his shoulder, Malfoy immediately strutted off towards the Slytherin common room with his 2 inseparable minions at an even more unrecognizable pace than usual. On the way back, Draco Malfoy came to feel that that was the most striking moment of his life, as every young wizard he passed threw him looks of envy and awe, looks that made Malfoy raise his head even higher. Whoops! With his head too high to see the path beneath him, Malfoy tripped over an uneven tile and fell forward. Fish jumped backwards over his shoulder in time to land on the shoulder of Big Dummy Goyle. Malfoy took a few steps to steady himself and looked over his shoulder, saw that Fish was no longer there. He quickly turned his head and soon saw Fish with a new mount. Malfoy approached Goyle and hesitated. He wanted to put Fish back on his shoulders, but considering the character Fish had shown in the past, he felt he was probably making a fool of himself. As Malfoy hesitated, the slow Goyle finally saw what he was thinking and unconsciously took half a step back and turned his body sideways so that the shoulder Fish was leaning on was hidden behind his head. It was only after this that Goyle realized what he had just done, and hurriedly returned to his normal standing position, a simple but embarrassed smile on his face. Malfoy glared at Goyle with a stern look, not intending to chase after him, but instead he gave up on trying to get Fish to jump back up, turned around and continued walking towards the Slytherin dormitory. "What are you standing there for? Follow me," Malfoy shouted grumpily. Goyle, in a rare act of ingenuity, quickly followed, and Crabbe, with an envious glance at Fish over his partner's shoulder, muttered something under his breath and quickly followed. With Malfoy deliberately quickening his pace, the three of them and the cat soon reached the Hogwarts basement, where Malfoy stopped in front of an empty, damp stone wall. Ambitious! At Malfoy's command, a stone door suddenly appeared in the wall and slowly opened. Malfoy walked in, followed by Goyle and Crabbe. "Ah! It's Fish!" As soon as they entered the Slytherin common room, a group of young wizards eagerly gathered around and expertly pulled several snacks out of their pockets and handed them to Fish. Fish jumped off Goyle's shoulder, transformed into his human form and greeted the group with a smile as he accepted the snacks. "Hello. Sit here for a bit, I'll get the cod." Malfoy frowned, said to Fish and hurried to his dormitory. Fish nodded indifferently, opened a bag of snacks and popped them into his mouth, before looking curiously around the Slytherin common room. It was a long, narrow, low basement, with green chandeliers, beautifully carved and expensive-looking tables and chairs. Even the mantelpiece was beautifully carved, and the floor was covered in an intricately patterned wool carpet, a completely different style to the Gryffindor common room. But in contrast to this beautiful furnishings, the walls and ceiling were of rough stone, which did not clash with the green light. What interested Fish most was the occasional flash of fish through the window, and the huge octopus in the black lake. Fish ran to the window in 2 steps, grabbed the edge of a window and tried to open it. "Wait a minute, Fish. This window can't be opened." The Slytherins in the common room rushed to stop Fish, who had failed to open the window and was about to break the glass. Meow. Chapter 43, Loved by All. "What are you doing, meow?" Fish didn't like being stopped. "I'm just seeing if I can catch something out there, why are you stopping me?" "The water's coming in," a freckled Slytherin boy replied bitterly. "The Slytherin dorms are under the Black Lake, if you open the window, it'll flood all the Slytherin dorms." Meow. Fish cocked his head to the side and then clapped his hands in excitement, "Just like the bathtub? Wouldn't that be nice?" And with that, Fish motioned to remove the window. This terrified the Slytherin students. They huddled together, threw their arms around Fish's waist and arms, pulling him in tight. "No. No, you can't," one of the little witches who had her arm around Fish persuaded tearfully, "it's not like emptying a bathtub, we'll all drown." At the same time, he was glad that Fish hadn't been assigned to Slytherin, which was a shame, but at least it didn't endanger his life. Fish was a bit stubborn, but much better than when he was adopted by Professor McGonagall, and seeing that he couldn't seem to open the window, he gave up on the idea. With his index finger in his mouth, Fish reluctantly looked out the window at the fish swimming in the water, but "I want to eat fish." Seeing Fish's pitiful little face, the Slytherins in the room were about to agree to break the window, but they had the sense not to be fooled by the cute fish. "What are you all doing?" warily asked Malfoy, who had returned with a bag of smoked cod, looking around at the assembled crowd. "Fish, here's the fish." A Slytherin, also from a pure-blood family, jumped up next to Malfoy and, to his confusion, snatched the bag of cod from his hand and ran back to Fish's side. "Thanks, meow." Fish took the smoked cod from him and gulped it down happily. "Hey, Andre! That bag of cod is my dad's," Malfoy retorted, protesting loudly against the Slytherin who had taken his backpack. Yes, we all know it's your father's, Draco," Andre said. As a member of the pure-blood family, Andre Rozier's family power is not much worse than the Malfoy family, and he is even Draco's cousin, so naturally he will not be afraid of Draco Malfoy. However, to save himself trouble, Andre went to his side and explained quietly. After hearing Andre's reasoned explanation, Malfoy had no choice but to accept it and follow him into the crowd. With the smoked cod in his mouth, Fish saw Malfoy's appearance and waved his palm in front of him. "Meow. There you are, big brain. Where's the smoked cod? Malfoy. That's what I brought, Malfoy shouted frantically, pointing to the cod in Fish's hand. Meow, Fish looked at the smoked cod that was only half a tail in his hand, chewing unconsciously in his mouth. I think I heard Big Brain yell something a moment ago. But never mind, I've got the fish anyway. Shoving the last few pieces of tail into his mouth, Fish smiled at Malfoy, thanks for the meow cod, tastes good. With that, he lowered his head and went back to licking his fingers. Why do you keep calling me Big Brain? Asked Malfoy, who had changed his hairstyle, a little put off. Meow, Fish sucked his fingers and looked at Malfoy in confusion. However, before Malfoy could continue the conversation, Daphne Greengrass made her way towards him, pushing him away. Get out of my way when you're done serving the food. Big Brain. Malfoy, who was pushed away, glared at Daphne, snorted twice and retreated angrily with his two servants at his side. Daphne's family was closer to the Malfoys than Andres and Draco, and Daphne had known each other since they were very young, and the two families had often been related. The old man Malfoy, Draco spoke of, was not a deterrent to Daphne, rather, if Draco went to his father, he would be the one to suffer. As in Gryffindor, the Slytherin witches were quick to pull the boys aside and gather around Fish, but Slytherin had a clear hierarchy and only some of the witches, like Daphne, had a say, so it was much quieter in Slytherin than in Gryffindor. And it didn't matter that they couldn't talk to Fish, the witches were content to watch his pretty face and occasionally reach out to touch him when he wasn't looking. Fish, however, was not so happy, and found it annoying to be surrounded by human female cubs who chattered and occasionally touched him when he wasn't paying attention. It was less noisy than in Gryffindor, but it was still annoying. Thumping his head to avoid the restless paws of a few little witches, Fish slapped his hand on the table and stood up. I'll be right back. Wait a minute, Pansy Parkinson, who had left quietly earlier, came running over with a shiny dark-haired Persian cat in her arms. Fish, will you come make friends with my Tina? Pansy placed the cat in her arms on the table in front of Fish, who looked at him and then came over, rubbing his head against Fish's right hand on the table. Meow. Unlike Lady Norris, Pansy's Tina was much gentler and more affectionate, so Tina showed her affection right away. Meow. Hi, is your name Tina? Seeing his kindred spirit, Fish sat back down, leaned his head on the table, stared at the black Persian cat and spoke to it in feline language. Meow. Tina was startled by Fish's sudden use of cat language, and jumped back a little, looking at Fish twice in disbelief before cautiously bowing again. Meow, you can actually speak cat language. Meow, because it was originally a cat, Fish said, turning back into a tabby cat and landing on the table, waving his paw at Tina. Meow. Tina was startled again. But being a cat from the magical world, and with the added comfort of animal affinity, Tina quickly accepted the scenario and joined Fish, and the two kittens meowed and chattered, occasionally giving each other a paw. The Slytherins around them didn't disturb the two cats as they joked and laughed, but watched them play with fond faces. Pansy, well done, Daphne patted Pansy's shoulder appreciatively. Like Malfoy, Pansy was a distant relative and childhood friend of Daphne's, and since they were both girls, they were a little closer. Pansy lifted her chin a little proudly. You should have picked a pet cat, like me. They had gone to Diagon Alley together to buy school supplies, and when it came to choosing a pet, Pansy had taken her cat, which she had bred, while Daphne had bought an owl. Daphne pursed her lips. Who would have thought there would be a special person like Fish in the first-year students? Hogwarts didn't allow students to bring more than one pet, and Daphne wasn't about to replace her owl. Upon her return from the vacations, she was to try to convince Astoria to choose a cat as a pet, and it must be a silver tabby. After watching her best friend use her pet cat to contact Fish, clever Daphne thought of using her sister. Chapter 44, Dancing Plant. After playing with his new friend for a while, Fish wanted to leave again. After all, cats tend to communicate more casually and rarely stay together for long periods of time. Daphne and the girls resisted his departure, but did not have the temerity to force Fish to stay. As Fish exited the stone doors of Slytherin, he ran into his head of house, Professor Severus Snape. Seeing Fish emerge from his house dormitory, Professor Snape couldn't help but frown. By now, he knew that he had shown Fish mercy, not because he had green eyes like Lily, but because he had a similar ability to Avila. This was not acceptable to Snape, who was a master of occlumency, and not even Dumbledore and Voldemort could influence him mentally. However, no matter how much Professor Snape delved into his occlumency, he still couldn't help but have a good impression when confronted with Fish, which was no doubt a silent mockery for a master of occlumency. He had no choice but to ignore Fish in class, but when he didn't turn in his work, Snape could subtract points from Gryffindor without fear of confronting him. Now that he had bumped into Fish, who was coming out of the Slytherin dormitory, the two thoughts of 5 points off for Gryffindor and Fish is so cute, let's forget it popped into Snape's head at the same time, leaving him torn. But just as Snape was in the middle of a battle, Fish was the first to greet him. Because Minerva had said to be polite to those professors. "Hello, Professor Greasehead." Professor Snape's face twitched twice, his lips tightly pressed together. There was a long silence before a cold snort came from his hawkish nose. "Oh, well," the boy's eyes looked just like Lily's. "Well, not really, after all, Lily's eyes can't turn into needles like a cat's, or fill the whole eyeball. Just treat it as a favor to Professor McGonagall." After a violent mental struggle, Snape decided not to mess with Fish, but he still had to have the right attitude. "You have to show some courtesy to a professor, Fish McGonagall." "Meow." Fish cocked his head. "I'm polite enough to greet you, meow." Professor Snape closed his eyes and let out a long sigh, sensing that any further conversation with Fish would only make his head hurt more. He nodded nonchalantly, shook out the black robe and turned back to his office. Fish said, "Goodbye Professor Greasehead, meow." And then Professor Snape walked even faster. "How rude, meow." Fish wrinkled his nose when he didn't get a response and headed for the kitchen out of habit. "Fish! Are you going to take food from the kitchen again?" The new Hufflepuff student, Justin Finch, happened to see Fish's figure and greeted him hurriedly. Since the dormitories were right next to the Hogwarts kitchens, most of the students Fish encountered in the kitchens were from Hufflepuff, so besides Gryffindor, Fish knew the Hufflepuff students best. "It's curly hair." Fish waved at Justin when he saw the curly-haired one, then replied, "No meow, I just got my fill at Green Snake Academy." "You actually went into the Slytherin dorm?" said Justin in surprise. The location of the Slytherin dormitory had always been the most mysterious. People from the other three houses basically only knew that it was located in the basement of Hogwarts. Only Slytherin students would know where the entrance was. It is said that the Slytherin common room hasn't been accessible to outsiders for 700 years, not to mention that Fish is a Gryffindor. Justin guessed that Fish was probably the first Gryffindor to be invited into the Slytherin dormitory since the establishment of Hogwarts. In fact, according to the Hufflepuff seniors, the Hufflepuff dormitories hadn't been seen in over 1,000 years, and although the Gryffindor dormitories were also hidden, the Gryffindor students weren't too concerned, so many others from the houses knew the exact location and had even been invited in by the young lions. Only the arrogant Ravenclaw did not hide his quarters, but almost no one but Ravenclaw could answer the question posed by the bronze eagle-shaped door. Fish licked his lips and replied cheerfully, "Yes, I was invited by Gran Cerebro, and they treated me to a delicious cod, meow." Well," Justin froze and, on second thought, decided that, if it was Fish, it didn't seem too hard to accept. And then, for some reason, confrontational or not, Justin made a creepy invitation to Fish, "So, do you want to come see us in the Hufflepuff dorm?" Meow. Yeah, Fish's eyes lit up. The different view of the Slytherin dorms had been new to him, and after Justin reminded him, Fish had been curious about the Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw dorms as well. "Well, come with me." Justin, who had been successful in the invitation, was also very excited, waved Fish over and led him down the hall on the right side of the kitchen. The two came to a stack of vats in the right corner of the hallway, and Justin tapped the bottom of the second vat in the middle of the second row, and the lid opened to reveal a hidden passageway. As they walked down the passageway, Justin made a point of introducing Fish. "Hufflepuff is the only house at Hogwarts that has magic that repels infiltrators, so if you hit the wrong lid, or hit the wrong beat, you'll get soaked in vinegar." "Vinegar?" Fish crinkled his face unconsciously. "That sour water? I hate that, meow." As for Justin's comment about the proper way in, Fish didn't care. He didn't even bother to remember the Gryffindor password. How could he remember how to get into other dorms? Anyway, Fish had found another way to open the door: let Comey or other house elves into the dormitory and tell Scarhead to come out and open the door for him. Or he could just lie outside in a conspicuous place and sleep, and then it wouldn't be long before the mean old man or Minerva would show up and send him into the bedroom, and he could pretend to be asleep. Fish is so smart. Entering the Hufflepuff common room, Fish turned a deaf ear to the shouts of the young wizards around him and surveyed the furnishings. The Hufflepuff common room was a different kind of room, also in the basement, but with bright sunlight streaming in through the circular windows above. In addition, the room was decorated with a variety of plants that Professor Pomona Sprout brings in from time to time, taking advantage of her authority. For a druid, this environment surrounded by plants made Fish feel very comfortable. Meow. Fish eagerly stepped forward, shifting into his cat form in midair, and leapt onto the windowsill in 3 steps, next to a plant with long, thin leaves. Apparently disturbed by Fish, the plant suddenly began to twist and turn, and the rustling of the cascading leaves produced a pleasant sound. "It's a dancing plant," said one of the Hufflepuff girls as she approached Fish. It was one of the main ingredients in the original Potion of Joy formula, but when a better formula was discovered, it became an ornamental plant. Fish touched the tip of his nose to the herb dancing in front of him and understood its effects. In fact, aside from the reason the little witch had given, there was also the slight side effect that an excess of it could make one dance intermittently, regardless of time or place. Fish stuck out his little tongue and licked the dancing blades of the dancing grass, not intending to eat it. Normal cats have to nibble on grasses and leaves from time to time to cleanse their bellies of hairballs, but Fish did not. Since he had swallowed the light pellets, he no longer had to use the plant fibers to clean his belly of hairballs. He ran to the dancing grass because his druidic instincts told him it would do him good to come here, and because there was plenty of sunlight on the windowsill, allowing him to get a good night's sleep. Fish found a comfortable spot on the windowsill and curled into a ball, falling asleep under the rustling blades of grass and the warmth of the sun. Chapter 45, Flowering of Plants. The warm sunlight falling on Fish's small body dyed his silver-grey fur a golden color, making him look like a sleeping tiger cub from a distance. The grass dancing next to Fish kept twisting and turning, producing a not too loud rustling sound. The common room, which had become somewhat noisy with Fish's arrival, gradually fell silent. The Hufflepuffs in the room quietly took their seats, pulled out their books or homework, and went about their business in silence while enjoying the calm, healing atmosphere. However, the students in the hall did not notice that, except for the dancing grass next to Fish, other plants in the common room also swayed gently in Fish's breath, and in their leaves there was also a faint green light. Under this green light, the plants in the Hufflepuff room became more vibrant than ever. Although the little wizards present did not notice the changes in these plants, under the influence of this silent breath of life, all the Hufflepuff who remained in the common room, unknowingly, their heads became clearer and the efficiency of reading and writing homework has improved slightly. The improvement was not significant and gradually weakened over time. It took about 10 minutes for the resonance between the plants and the fragment of the world tree to fade, and the dancing plants around them gathered their leaves, as if tired of dancing, and lay quietly in their pots. After another half-hour or so, Fish came out of his sleep and shook his head in amazement that he had slept so soundly in a strange place. Even if he liked the smell here, this situation was also a bit strange. He had slept in the forest before, where the smell of the vegetation was stronger, and he still had his natural vigilance. But after thinking about it for a while and not being able to figure it out, Fish stopped thinking about it. After all, he was just a kitten and had no interest in investigating such oddities. Fish stood up from the windowsill, front paws outstretched, upper body on the ground and buttocks up, stretched out comfortably, then sat and licked his fur carefully for a while. The routine was completed before he jumped off the windowsill and started wandering around the common room, leaving paw prints and scent marks wherever he wanted. The little Hufflepuff wizards didn't stop him either, watching him with a smile as he pulled out scraps of some wood products in the hall. Once he left his mark, Fish walked outside at a brisk pace. "Fish, are you leaving?" asked Cedric Diggory in a soft voice as he stood up. "Meow," Fish replied, nodding, and as much as he liked the smell of the plants in the Hufflepuff common room, right now he was more interested in satisfying his curiosity, checking out the Ravenclaw common room. This was the only one left, and Fish said he would do anything to see it. Like the Slytherin snakes, the Badgers were reluctant to part with Fish, but they said nothing to hold him back and all said goodbye to Fish. "Come play again sometime. Next time you're here, be sure to try the muggle snacks my mother sends. I'll ask my family to send some snacks too. Do you like muggle cat food?" Dismissed by a group of small badgers, Fish exited the Hufflepuff dormitory and ran upstairs. Driven by curiosity and now with a full stomach, Fish headed for the West Tower without stopping, knowing exactly what he was looking for. The Ravenclaw had never hidden the location of his dormitories from the beginning, running up a long winding staircase in the West Tower to the very top. At the top of a long winding staircase in the West Tower was a door with no doorknob and only a brass ring in the shape of an eagle, which was the entrance to the Ravenclaw common room. When Fish reached the top of the Ravenclaw tower, there was another Ravenclaw freshman trapped in the doorway because he couldn't answer the eagle's question. Meow. Fish walked over to Padma Paddle's feet and touched his ankle with his paw. Gee, Padma, who was thinking, was startled and took a sharp step to the side, looking at the ground in panic. Fish was also taken aback by his reaction and jumped back, looking at the startled little witch with a confused expression. Fish? What are you doing here? Padma's expression turned from panic to surprise when she realized that it was Fish, the school favorite, who had touched her. She knelt down and tried to hug the cute kitten, but Fish easily avoided it with another little jump. Would you like a snack? Undeterred, Padma pulled a licorice wand from her pocket and waved it in front of Fish's face. Ever since Fish had become a small fan, young wizards at Hogwarts had become accustomed to carrying snacks with them, and Padma was no exception. Fish's head bobbed back and forth with the licorice wand in front of him for a few moments, before he shoved it away with a paw. He'd eaten enough in Slytherin, he didn't have much of an appetite now. No? Asked Padma once more, putting her snacks away with a hint of disappointment. By the way, you haven't told me why you're here. The next second, Fish assumed human form, but remained in a crouched position, hands clasped together and resting on the ground in front of him. I'd like to look inside, meow. Fish pointed to the eagle-ringed door to the side. Replied Padma with a slightly embarrassed expression, the Ravenclaw common room isn't open to anyone from other houses, but only if you answer the eagle's questions yourself. If you don't, even Ravenclaw students can't enter the... Meow. Fish cocked his head to the side and said with a start, so that's why you're out, three-eyed girl. The Paddle sisters had a sparkly ornament on their foreheads above their eyebrows, as was customary in their home country, so Fish called them three-eyed girl and three-eyed sister. Padma's expression became even more embarrassed as she nodded her head slightly and then forced her voice, actually, I'm about to find out the answer. But Fish didn't care if she could answer the question or not. As soon as he had figured out how to get into the Ravenclaw common room, he had left Padma behind and was running towards the common room door, tapping the eagle ring on it. The bronze eagle on the door came to life in an instant, folding its outstretched wings and opening its crooked beak to ask the question that had caught Padma Paddle on the outside. What is life? Fish answered loudly and without hesitation, eat, drink, play, have fun. Meow. Fi, fi. The eagle silently spread its wings and closed its mouth, turning into a statue. Chapter 46, Fish is so smart. Meow. Fish cocked his head, confused, then turned his head to Padma, three-eyed girl, why don't you speak meow? Padma hesitated for a moment before replying with a smile, I guess the eagle wasn't happy with your answer. Fish was instantly displeased, why, meow. Why live if not to eat, drink, and have fun? Said Fish. Before Padma could explain the answer to the eagle's ring question, Fish had already turned around and tapped the ring on the door at the foot of the bronze eagle. What is, comma? The reanimated eagle had just started to say, when Fish interrupted him forcefully. Why isn't the meaning of life to eat, drink and be merry? Fish shouted, pulling the brass ring from under his feet. It was probably the first time the ring had been questioned at his trial, and after a long moment of silence he replied, that's too shallow an answer, I need an answer that shows more of your wisdom. Fish frowned, not quite understanding what the eagle was saying. He was obviously so smart, an answer that shows more of my wisdom. But obviously, the bronze eagle in front of him could not understand the cat's wisdom. After forcing the eagle to open the door in vain, Fish could only answer the question honestly. If I wasn't curious about what's inside, I wouldn't have bothered to do it. Fish angrily knocked on the door again. What is life? At this unvarying question from the eagle, Fish cocked his head to one side for a moment and decided that perhaps his previous answer wasn't specific enough, so he tentatively replied, what about, dried minnows? Without a word, the eagle turned back into a bronze statue. Meow, did I get it wrong again? The kitten didn't give up again, and before the eagle could put his wings back in place, Fish tapped the door ring again. What's? This time, before the eagle could finish his question, an anxious Fish gave his final answer, bee candy. Ice rats. Chocolate frog. Fish persevered and kept waking the eagle, and answered the answer as a password to the principal's office. This. Fish, Padma couldn't take it anymore and called out to Fish who kept harassing the bronze eagle. Meow. That's not going to work, you're answering in the wrong direction. Padma was organizing her words, thinking about how to clarify the concept of the eagle's question to Fish. Meow, in the wrong direction. Fish raised his head slightly, looking up at the ceiling for a moment, and suddenly seemed to have come to his senses. I know, meow. If all the food I like didn't work, then it must be the food I don't like. Reaching out once more to tap the ring on the door, Fish confidently tossed out his answer without waiting for the eagle to say anything or for the three-eyed girl to stop him. Bertie Bott's grages of all flavors. Because of the flavor he didn't like, Fish didn't like this snack very much. That's not the case. As soon as Padma said that, the bronze eagle at the door nodded and opened the door to the Ravenclaw common room. I can't accept that, the little witch cringed with her head in her hands, having thought about it for half a day, but it was no match for the wrong one, from Fish. The eagle was probably fed up with Fish. Did you let him in on purpose? Padma raised her head and cast a suspicious glance at the bronze eagle, who had turned into a statue. Unaware that her misadventure had made the three-eyed girl suspicious of her housekeeper, she slipped into the Ravenclaw common room as soon as the doors opened. Of course, it made the little wizards inside exclaim for a moment. Fish! How did you get in here? All the big guys gathered around with a look of surprise. As eccentric as the Ravenclaws were, they couldn't resist the charm of the kitten's animal affinity. I answered the bird's question right and she let me in, Fish said with his head held high and his arms folded proudly. Fish is so smart. The idiot girl from Three Eyes didn't know the answer, said Fish. As soon as Padma, who had successfully deduced her own answer based on Fish's answer, walked in, she heard Fish slander her and couldn't help but refute him loudly. Your answer is like a blind cat that hit a dead mouse. Fish pointed to his green eyes and glared at his. I'm not blind. That's not the point. Padma covered her forehead. This kind of conversation that wasn't on the same channel gave her a headache, and there was a vague sense of familiarity. In Ravenclaw, there weren't many people like Fish. Then why had Fish been assigned to Gryffindor? Padma thought angrily. Her sister Parvati kept bragging about how she had touched Fish's little head today and fed her, so the friendship between the two sisters almost broke down because of this. With that in mind, Padma stopped thinking about the eagle and took the opportunity to pet the cat while she could. She rushed through the crowd and made her way to Fish's side. The Ravenclaw hawks were always alone, and unlike the Slytherins and the happy Hufflepuffs, they talked to Fish about whatever interested them, as they saw fit. The Ravenclaw common room became noisy with all the chatter of the young wizards. The noise was a bit annoying to Fish, as was the fidgety little hands, and the fact that the Ravenclaw common room was similar to the Gryffindor common room in that it was in a tall tower with a view through the window. Although the view from the Ravenclaw window was slightly better, it didn't seem as interesting to Fish as the bronze eagle on the door. So after a casual stroll through the common room, Fish saw his chance to sneak out. The Ravenclaws, who had been arguing, calmed down for a few seconds before they started pointing fingers at each other. It's all your fault, you scared Fish. The boys blamed the little witches who always wanted to touch Fish. It's you guys who are always talking about things that don't interest Fish. Not to be outdone, the girls retorted sharply. Little did Fish know that the little Ravenclaw wizards were already in an uproar over him. He had intended to return to his dormitory after leaving the Ravenclaw common room, but in the middle of his walk, he suddenly remembered that he had run away because he had gotten into trouble, and if he went back now, he would probably run into the red-headed number 4 and the others. In time, Fish stopped in his tracks and transformed back into his cat form, slipping into a suit of armor near the Gryffindor dormitory. Until his housemates returned, Fish planned to stay here for the time being, taking a nap or something. Chapter 47, Good Brothers. Over there. Over there. Nice turn. Ah. I'm about to hit it. How did you manage to dodge that? A crowd of watching Gryffindors shouted from the Quidditch practice field. After 2 rounds of preliminary tryouts, it had been decided that the Gryffindor House Seeker would be decided between Harry Potter and Alicia Spinnet, but Captain Wood and Professor McGonagall were still unsure who to give the position to. In terms of flying, the difference between Harry Potter and Alicia Spinnet was not yet apparent, but it was a testament to Harry's talent for flying that he had only had 1 flying lesson. But while Alicia had the advantage of experience in flying and playing the game, Harry didn't even know the exact rules of Quidditch, and the fact that he was still a first-year maid would hesitate. Why don't we have a mock match? George and Fred, who weren't interested in being a seeker, saw Wood's hesitation and suggested it right away. Maybe they could perform better against each other. There was very little to see simply searching for and chasing the snitch, so Wood was quick to follow the twins' advice. He split Harry and Alice into 2 teams and added 2 bludgers, allowing George and Fred to join both teams with Ron and Seamus as batsmen, respectively. Because it is mainly to select the seeker and test the situation of the 2 in the showdown, the quaffle and the chaser are accepted for scoring. The main reason was that they didn't have enough people to form 2 full teams. And so began an abbreviated version of a mini-match. The difference between Harry and Alice was soon revealed as soon as they entered the competition. The surprise was that Harry Potter, a very inexperienced rookie, demonstrated an endurance and a talent for flying that he had not quite been able to demonstrate before by dodging the errant ball, performing one amazing flying maneuver after another in the air and easily escaping multiple bludger attacks. In contrast, Alicia was a bit more expressionless at this point, and while she had successfully dodged several bludger attacks, she was still significantly less adaptable than Harry, making her need the batter's help more than Harry. While Alice was still concentrating on dodging the bludger, Harry had already spotted the snitch, and drove another bludger into Alice's side before quickly separating on a nearly 90-degree rise. After breaking free of the 2 bludgers' pursuit, he took control of the broom without hesitation and raced towards the golden snitch. It's Potter. It's Harry Potter who has caught the golden snitch. A few moments later, Harry was holding the snitch in his hands, causing the young lions below to applaud. Calming his excitement, Harry took control of his flying broom and slowly descended from the sky. Harry! You were great! Ron jumped down from his broom and hugged Harry, excitedly shouting, "You're the future Gryffindor seeker." Aside from Ron, the rest of the Gryffindor team gathered around, chatting with Harry. Even Alicia Spinnet, who had lost to him, seemed delighted. As players, they could sense Harry's talent for finding the snitch with ease. Professor McGonagall, I have a bold idea. Wood, the team captain, didn't rush to Harry's side with his teammates, but said with a twinkle in his eye to Professor McGonagall at his side, "I'd like to make Harry the team seeker right away. It's been a long time since a first-year student has been a regular player." Professor McGonagall's mouth curved slightly, "But, I agree, Wood, I'll talk to Dumbledore. Gryffindor will do great things in the Quidditch Cup this year." Gryffindor is going to do great things. That's right, Wood nodded his head vigorously, full of pride. He really didn't think that even with the loss of Fish, the flying genius, that Harry, the talented seeker, could be chosen among the first years, and Wood was glad he had made this selection because of Fish. And in addition to Harry Potter, the twins' younger brother, Ron Weasley, has some talent for flying and could join the training as a substitute first. Next we'll have to get Harry a decent broom, Professor. Let's see, a Nimbus 2000 or a No. 7 sweeper. Wood looked away from Harry, who was surrounded, and muttered, "It wouldn't do for a seeker not to have a broom fast enough." Professor McGonagall said nothing as she walked toward Harry Potter. "Potter." Professor McGonagall's arrival silenced the Gryffindors around them. "Wood and I have decided that you will be the Gryffindor seeker." Professor McGonagall's stern gaze settled on Harry through the glasses. "I expect you to train hard afterwards and not let me change my mind." Yes, Professor," replied Harry nervously, standing up. Professor McGonagall looked at him with a serious expression for a few moments, until sweat began to form on Harry's forehead, and then she broke into a slight smile. "Your father would be proud of you," she said. "He used to be a great Quidditch player." With that, Professor McGonagall left a distraught Harry and turned to leave the Quidditch pitch. "Oh my God, Harry, did you hear that? You've become a seeker, not a substitute. You're an official seeker," Ron shouted as he jumped on his back excitedly. "You must be the youngest player on the house team in many years. A century, to be exact." A smiling Wood reached over, reaching out to pat Harry's shoulder, and then to an excited Ron, "Besides, I think you could make the house team, but now that it's full, you'll have to start from the bench." "Sure. I mean, no problem." Ron was so shocked by this huge surprise that he got a little dizzy. He had only done slightly better than Seamus at the tryout, and had thought he was just a contestant, but he hadn't expected to be included on the academy team. Just as Ron was rejoicing, 2 familiar arms were draped over his shoulders, one left and one right. "Oh, my dear red-headed number 4, we're going to be as good a team as we were with Charlie," George said with a mischievous grin. "But before that happens, we have to train hard," Fred, who also had evil intentions, continued, adding more emphasis on the word hard. "And of course, don't worry, we'll take good care of you as brothers," George also added emphasis to the word care. With the 2 good brothers saying the same thing, Ron's giddy emotions cooled at a noticeable rate. The thought of having to spend all of his Quidditch training with his twin brothers made Ron Weasley suddenly feel that being on the house team was nothing to be happy about. Chapter 48, The Bold Cat. When Harry and his group finished the tests, they returned to the dormitory talking and laughing all the way, and then everyone was stunned. Their belongings were strewn all over the floor, their bed curtains and wall posters had been ripped off, and the clean sheets were covered with little paw prints that looked like plum blossoms, and if you looked closely, you could see some small footprints in the sheets. During non-holidays, if there is no special request, the Hogwarts house elves will tidy up the common room and not enter the dormitory. After all, tidying is not a particularly difficult spell to learn, and even first-year muggles who have been at Hogwarts for a while can learn to use it to tidy their rooms. Oh my goodness, it's Scabbers. Ron, the owner, was the first to notice the smaller footprints, and reacted in an instant. He hurried over to his bed, lifted the tent that had fallen down, and looked near the pillows. A slightly plump mouse was lying on its back next to Ron's pillow, looking like it had died. Merlin's broken hat. Are you alive, Scabbers? Ron grabbed Scabbers, held him under his nose and looked him over carefully, and discovered that his chest was still up and down, and there seemed to be no obvious scars on his body except for a few missing strands of hair, so he took a deep breath and exhaled a long sigh of relief. It seemed that Fish had shown some mercy. It was true, although Fish tended to be a bit more animated, he was generally a nice guy. After ascertaining that Scabbers' life was not in danger, Ron relaxed. However, he still worried about his pet. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have left you alone in the dormitory, Ron whispered his apologies to Scabbers, hugging him. Scabbers, who had already woken up, turned his green bean-sized eyes and looked at Ron, snorted in response and then followed in Ron's hand with no intention of moving. Although Scabbers had been half dead in the morning, he had recovered from a long rest. Now he was only motionless, due to the fact that he wanted to show Ron the consequences of leaving him alone. If he could, Scabbers, or Peter Pettigrew, would be tempted to run away. After all, he was so weak in his animal form that there was no room to cry if Fish ate him for a snack before he had a chance to change back. It was a shame to give up the identity of Scabbers after so long, and since Ron happened to be Harry's roommate, he would have had a hard time finding another identity that would give him easy access to Harry Potter. Above all, of course, after 2 chases, Peter Pettigrew was convinced that Fish was no real danger to him, otherwise he would have fled. But Peter Pettigrew also swore in his heart that if he ever regained his identity, he would make the little wizard named Fish suffer. The hatred of being frightened was deeper than the inexplicable feeling of affection. As Peter Pettigrew gritted his teeth and thought of his future revenge, Fish, who had been gone for a long time, returned to the dormitory. Having been hiding inside a suit of armor, Fish had noticed Harry's return and waited until everyone was in the hole in the wall behind the portrait of the fat lady before exiting the suit of armor. Using the password he had just heard to pass the fat lady's portrait without trouble, Fish returned to the dormitory a step slower than Harry and the others. As soon as he entered the dormitory, Fish began to whine, "Meow. What a mess you've made in the room. Phi Omega Phi?" Everyone else turned their heads to look at Fish in the bedroom doorway, with a look that was 3 parts reproach, 7 parts helplessness and 90 of affection. "Fish, your little footprints are still there," Seamus pointed to the obvious trail of cat prints on the sheet. "We don't have our claws that sharp either." Dean removed the soccer poster he'd taped next to his bed, revealing the claw marks on the back wall. "The bottom line is, no one is going to chase poor Scabbers but you." Ron picked up Scabbers, who was still motionless in his hand, taking the opportunity to express his pet's displeasure. "Meow." Fish sheepishly averted his gaze and began to play dumb. "Your English is so complicated that Fish doesn't understand, meow." "Who are you kidding?" Seamus Finnegan held Fish's head and rubbed his hair hard. "Meow meow meow meow. Omega?" Knowing better, Fish didn't resist and let Seamus rub him hard. Harry and the others got hot. It was the first time, apart from Professor McGonagall, that Fish had let someone else do it without resistance. Even Seamus himself hadn't expected it to go so well. He had started out thinking about delivering as many blows to Fish's head as possible. As Seamus stared in amazement at his right hand, Harry and the others leaned silently towards Fish, hands slightly curled, eager to get their hands to Fish's head. "Meow." The alert Fish instantly sensed that his housemates were up to no good and jumped back, still looking human, but posing a menacing stance on all fours with his back arched. "Ha!" Seeing Fish's obvious resistance, the children stopped in their tracks. "Ahem. So, let's tidy up the bedroom and clean it up." Seamus, who had managed to rub Fish's head, broke the ice by pulling out his wand and waving it over his messy bed. The others had to give up their plans to pet the cat for the moment and followed Seamus to tidy up the mess Fish had made. The two spells, Cleanse and Restore, were simple and common, but it took some effort to get it to work perfectly. New wizards tended to use the Cleanse spell for personal hygiene, but the more difficult Restore spell was something only a few of the new students could learn, so it took a lot of effort for Seamus and the others to fix up a dormitory. Harry Potter and Dean Thomas in particular, who hadn't been exposed to the wizarding world, weren't even very good at the Cleanse spell. Fish watched as his companions struggled to return the room to its original state and, after a moment's hesitation, decided to give them a hand. He was a good cat who dared to do something, only if he got caught, of course. But instead of pulling out his wand and joining in, Fish took a deep breath. "Comey!" Fish shouted at the top of his lungs. Ron and the others were startled by the shout and stopped their movements to look at Fish. Before Fish's voice could lower, they heard another piercing rustle next to Fish, and then a short, wrinkled figure wrapped in old curtains appeared in the bedroom. "What can I do for you, Master Fish?" Chapter 49, Being Confined Again. Fish's bedroom was soon back to its original state thanks to the house elf's skillful spells. Ron and the others looked at each other, then shrugged and put away their wands, which had been of little use. They knew Comey, the house elf, who often brought Fish back from his nightly excursions, and who had woken Harry and the others not once but twice with the piercing sound of his apparition. "If you need anything, just say Comey's name. I'll listen to you," Comey said after he finished tidying up the room, bowing deeply to Harry Potter and the others, before disappearing from the bedroom. "Excellent. I've always wanted a house elf." Ron waved his arms excitedly. As the only pure blood in the dormitory, he and Neville would know a little more about house elves. And unlike the Longbottoms, the Weasleys didn't even have a house elf. In fact, Ron was quite puzzled at first. Even though his family is poor, he can still afford house elves. After all, these little guys have extremely low demands on themselves and don't consume any resources. But whenever Ron asked the question, his parents always deflected the subject and talked about other things. Later, he learned from his siblings why. Although house elves didn't need to be paid and required very little in the way of food and lodging, there were really only a limited number of them, and they were largely in the hands of the old pureblood families. Hogwarts has many house elves, mainly due to the legacy of the four founders and the headmasters and professors, and some homeless house elves have been taken in by Hogwarts for various reasons. Arthur and Molly were from old pureblood families, but they had run away from their families and had not inherited their house elves from their own families. Now Comey wasn't really theirs, but he was good enough that Ron could use a house elf at school from time to time. "If Mum knew, she'd envy me." Ron's grin went up to his ears. "She always wished we had a house elf to iron our clothes." But Ron's mirth was not echoed by the others. Longbottom, who also belongs to the honorable 28 pureblood families, naturally has house elves. Although Longbottom's elf was inherited by Neville's uncle, Neville had at least been looked after by a house elf for a while, so it didn't seem like a big deal to him. On the other hand, Dean, Seamus, and Harry have no concept of house elves. In fact, many ordinary wizards have never seen house elves in their lives. Their knowledge of elves comes from books like History of Magic. What difference does it make to Fish, whether he has a house elf or not? After a moment of happiness, Ron noticed that everyone else seemed quiet, hurried to hide his embarrassment by pretending to cough, and quickly changed the subject. "Fish, you know what? Harry and I have joined Gryffindor." Ouch! Ron was halfway through his sentence when Harry cut him off with a stealthy kick. Then he realized that Fish had been upset about not being able to ride brooms and owls for the past 2 days, and wasn't he irritating Fish by now talking about Quidditch? In fact, Fish had forgotten about it at the time, as there were plenty of fun things to do at school. Even if he can't fly, he can usually climb to a high place, so the flying broom wasn't high on Fish's list of priorities. Meow. Fish, who was sitting cross-legged on his bunk, fiddling with some gobstones, raised his head. Looked at Ron and cocked his head to one side, confused. "What did you and Scarhead join in on?" "Well, gasped Ron, using the only thing he was good at as an excuse. "We joined the Gryffindor Magical Chess Club." "Right, Harry?" "Hey? Oh. Yes, we are," Harry nodded his head. "Magic chess. Omega?" Fish remembered, he still had an impression of this thing. A group of small chess pieces, after being hit by him, became much more obedient. However, for things like chess, Fish is not good at it. He could not understand the rules, why some pieces could only move diagonally and others in a straight line, and why both players take turns to move their pieces. It seemed to Fish that it was okay to move as many moves as he wanted, as fast as he wanted, and as many moves as he wanted. So after listening to Ron's introduction to the rules of magic chess, he quickly lost interest. It's no fun. Fish put his head back down and continued to pick up the gobstones that were strewn across the bed. Of course, he knew nothing of the rules of gobstones, but they were little round balls, and to Fish they were much more interesting than magic chess. After a few moments of fiddling with the gobstones, Fish transformed back into his cat form, then quickly climbed up the upholstered bedposts to the top of the bed and lay down on it. All Harry and the others could see were Fish's 4 little paws sticking out from the edge of the bed, and a tail that wagged from time to time, showing the tip mischievously before quickly retracting. Lately, Fish has become accustomed to resting and sleeping on top of the bed, although he doesn't spend most of his time sleeping in the bedroom. Once Fish calmed down, the room naturally quieted down, and Harry and the others, who were exhausted from the day, took advantage of the time to rest as well. It wasn't until dinner time that they learned that Fish had spent the day wandering around the other 3 common rooms. But this wasn't something too difficult for Fish to understand, so the Gryffindors were surprised for a moment and then thought nothing of it. Only the twins had been trying to figure out how to get into the Slytherin common room on Fish's behalf after they found out about it. But, unfortunately, Fish couldn't even remember the password to his own dormitory, let alone Slytherin's. It had been left on Malfoy and Crabbe's shoulders when he went to the Slytherin common room, and he hadn't left a scent mark along the way, so he couldn't even tell them exactly where it was. The twins had no choice but to give up when they got no answer. As George and Fred kept promising to remember the location of the Slytherin common room and the password next time, Professor McGonagall, who had finished dinner, approached them. Fish was the first to pounce on her, wrapping his arms around her and rubbing her, to the envy of the young wizards, Minerva. Professor McGonagall patted Fish's little head, a smile creeping onto her face as she kept a straight face and looked at the twins. 9 o'clock at night, still in the hall, your confinement is not over. Fish, who didn't quite understand the word confinement, threw his hands up in the air and cheered, "Great! We can be confined again tonight." George and Fred. Chapter 50, Kittens Will Never Be Slaves. Soon it was 8:50 p.m. and Fish's second lock-in was about to begin. Still thinking that the lock-in consisted of eating, drinking, and walking, Fish went ahead of the others, followed by a dejected George and Fred. Once again, the trio reached the foyer, where they were still greeted by Filch and Professor McGonagall. "You two, come with me." Filch handed Fish a small bag of dried fish he had fried before greeting George and Fred, a schadenfreude grin on his sullen face. "Professor Snape was so pleased with your work yesterday that he has brought another batch of Billywig from Diagon Alley, and your job today is to collect his slime for Professor Snape." Filch's grin widened as he explained the evening's task to the twins. "Oh, no." The thought of having to face a bunch of Billywig later and get his bob brought a wave of pain to the twins' faces. Filch had a much easier job for Fish than the hapless Weasley twins. "Your job tonight is to clean up all these trophies." Professor McGonagall led Fish to the third-floor awards room, pointing to the glass cases with trophies, shields, medals and statues. At first, Filch tried to choose a lighter assignment for Fish, but Professor McGonagall dismissed it as too light to educate him, so this was the chosen task. Meow. But Fish didn't listen to Professor McGonagall's words. Instead, he crawled into one of the trophies, as he had done on his previous night out, and snuggled comfortably inside. Meow. "Minerva, these trophies are so comfy to sleep in." Fish's cute little head poked out of the trophy and called out to Professor McGonagall. He was familiar with this room, and would come here to sleep at least 7 or 8 times out of every 10 nightly tours. In fact, he had tried to take a trophy into the dormitory, but the next day the trophy would be returned by the house elves, and Fish had no choice but to give up. "You're here to clean them up. Not for you to sleep." Scowling, Professor McGonagall took 3 steps to Fish's side and reached out to grab him by the back of the neck. Meow. "Don't pick me up again." Fish rolled onto his belly at Professor McGonagall's outstretched hand and waved his little paws to keep his from grabbing him. Although Fish is still a kitten, his strength is by no means small. Professor McGonagall's palm was easily brushed aside by him, and he was unable to catch the little cat curled up in the trophy. "Get out!" said Professor McGonagall sternly. "Meow." "No," said Fish, curled up. I'll be mad if you don't come out," said Professor McGonagall. "Meow. I'll be mad, too," said Fish. "After all the trouble you've caused, how can you be mad?" said Professor McGonagall. "Meow. I've tidied up the house, why do I have to be punished?" said Fish. "It's to teach you a lesson," said Professor McGonagall. "Meow. Meow. I have a good memory. Next time I won't get caught by Minerva," said Fish. Professor McGonagall. "Fish. Fish, meow, omega. Fish McGonagall," shouted Professor McGonagall. Hearing Minerva start to shout his full name, Fish reluctantly crawled out of the trophy. Comey, Fish, who was human again, immediately called out to his own house elf. "Master Fish." "Professor McGonagall. Good evening. What can I do for you?" The moment Comey appeared, he bent down until the tip of his nose could touch the ground and greeted Fish and Professor McGonagall. "Clean up the trophies here for me, meow," Fish said. "No, we don't need you here for now," said Professor McGonagall. Said Fish and Professor McGonagall, one after the other, leaving Comey in a quandary. "Meow, why, meow." Fish looked at Professor McGonagall in surprise. "I agreed to clean the trophy." "You're the one being punished, how can you let Comey clean the trophy?" "Do it yourself." Professor McGonagall gave Fish's fleshy cheeks a nasty tug, and her voice calmed considerably. Mostly because she had just argued with Fish so much that her voice was getting a little tired. Fish pulled his head away from Professor McGonagall's grip and rubbed her cheeks as he shouted in exasperation, "Minerva is a liar. That's not how confinement works." "This is confinement, that was Filch looking after you." Reassuring herself, Professor McGonagall patiently lectured Fish, "The purpose of confinement is to make you see the error of your ways, the same way I used to make you stay at home." Meow. After the example of the meaning of confinement, Fish finally understood the concept of confinement. "Then I don't like confinement. I want to go back to my room." With that, Fish tried to run away, but Professor McGonagall, who knew him well, grabbed him by the back of the neck. "Meow. Let go of me. I don't want to be confined anymore." Fish struggled, staggering Professor McGonagall with a strength far beyond that of a normal child. Fearing that Professor McGonagall would fall, Fish immediately stopped his movements and turned his head with a pitying expression. "Is this what you can't have if you don't want it?" After regaining her balance, Professor McGonagall gave Fish a gentle smack on the head. Though she knew the look was fake, the thoughtful gesture of the little man a moment ago had warmed Professor McGonagall's heart. Reaching out and patting Fish's head twice, Professor McGonagall said softly, "Be a good boy and clean up these trophies, and then we'll go to the kitchen and get something to eat." "Okay." Fish deflated and pulled his wand out of his robes. "No wands." Professor McGonagall snatched the wand from Fish's hand. Fish said, "Meow, don't overdo it, Minerva. It's not a punishment if you use magic." Professor McGonagall dodged Fish's short hand and stowed her wand in her coat pocket first. "Minerva, you bad girl." Fish puffed out his cheeks and shot a furious glare at Professor McGonagall, then, with a glint in his eye, he walked past his and at the same time transformed back into his original form, waving his four little paws and running for the door. He would never agree to such an unreasonable request if he couldn't use the spell. Ugh! Anticipating this, Professor McGonagall raised her wand and used a transformation spell on both the door and the window of the trophy display room. Several thick chains stretched out from the side walls with a metallic clang, sealing all exits from the room. "You're not leaving here today until you've cleaned these trophies," said Professor McGonagall. "Meow. I'm not going to work." With the exit blocked, Fish still refused to budge, and as he turned around, his body grew rapidly, facing Professor McGonagall in the form of a large cat. With his back arched, ears folded and fur bristling, Fish showed that he was not going to give in. He hadn't forgotten that he had a dream of defeating Minerva. Kittens will never become slaves.
Thanks for listening.